Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepy Scares. I know many of you tune in to unwind and drift off into a peaceful sleep, so before you settle in, I'd love for you to drop a comment, letting me know where in the world you're listening from. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get cozy, relax, and dive right in. Story 1. The scent of static clung to the air in the antique shop, a dry metallic tang that prickled the nostrils. No humming generators or rustling leaves here, just the quiet weight of forgotten objects. Elara trailed a finger along the chipped porcelain of a doll, its painted eyes unnervingly lucid. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the gloom, each a tiny, frantic universe. This wasn't her usual haunt. Elara, a cartographer by trade, preferred the crisp scent of paper and ink, the predictable order of lines on a map. But a strange pull had drawn her here, to this shop tucked away in a cobbled side street she'd never noticed before. Its window display, a chaotic jumble of tarnished silver and faded photographs, had seemed to shimmer with an inner light, beckoning her in. The shopkeeper, a man named Silas with eyes like clouded agates, hadn't greeted her. He sat perched on a stool behind the counter, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the middle distance. A low rhythmic clicking emanated from him, a soft, almost insectal sound. Elara initially dismissed it as a nervous habit, a clicking of teeth, or perhaps a pen against the counter. She wandered deeper into the labyrinthine aisles, each crammed with relics of lives, lived and lost. A tarnished birdcage hung precariously from the ceiling, its door ajar, as if its occupant had flown away decades ago. A stack of leather-bound journals lay open, their pages filled with spidery handwriting in a language she didn't recognize. The silence, broken only by Silas' quiet clicking, felt heavy, expectant. Then she saw it. On a high shelf, nestled amongst a collection of antique telescopes and barometers, sat a small wooden box. It was unassuming, almost plain, with no intricate carvings or embellishments. Yet, it drew her eye like a lodestone. It pulsed with a subtle, almost imperceptible warmth. As she reached for it, the clicking from the counter ceased. The sudden silence was more jarring than any sound. Elara glanced back. Silas was still there, but his posture had changed. He was completely still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his agate eyes fixed directly on her. His face was devoid of expression, a blank canvas. A cold dread seeped into Elara's bones. She quickly snatched the box from the shelf. It was surprisingly light, the wood smooth and cool beneath her fingertips. Turning back to the counter, she found Silas hadn't moved. His stillness was absolute, unnerving. The silence pressed against her eardrums, amplified by the absence of the clicking. "How much for this?" she asked, her voice a shaky whisper in the oppressive quiet. Silas didn't answer. He simply continued to stare, his gaze unnervingly intense. Elara felt a rising panic. Something was profoundly wrong. This wasn't just a quirky antique shop. It was something else entirely. Ignoring him, she placed the box on the counter. As it touched the aged wood, a faint whirring sound emanated from it. A high-pitched vibration that resonated in her teeth. It was subtle, almost inaudible, but it was there. Suddenly, Silas moved. With jerky, unnatural motions, he reached across the counter, his hand outstretched towards the box. His fingers were long and thin, the nails discolored and ridged. As his hand approached the box, the whirring intensified, becoming a low hum that filled the small shop. Elara recoiled, pulling the box back. Silas' hand continued its trajectory, hovering in the air where the box had been. His eyes remained fixed on her. But there was something new in them now. A flicker of something cold and calculating. a predatory awareness. Fear lent her a surge of adrenaline. She backed away, clutching the box tightly. The humming from it grew louder, resonating with a strange energy. She could feel a faint tingling in her fingertips where she held it. Silas began to move around the counter, his movements still jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. The clicking sound had returned, but it was different now. Faster, more frantic. It wasn't coming from his mouth, she realized with a jolt of horror. It was coming from inside him. She spun and fled, the box pressed against her chest. The bell above the shop door jingled frantically as she burst out onto the cobbled street. The sunlight felt blinding after the dimness of the shop. She didn't stop running until she reached the relative normalcy of the main thoroughfare. The sounds of traffic and pedestrian chatter a welcome relief. Her heart hammered against her ribs and she gasped for breath. She looked back. The antique shop stood silent and still, its window display a jumbled tableau of forgotten things. Silas was nowhere to be seen. Later, in the relative safety of her apartment, Alora examined the box. It was still warm, the faint hum still present. Hesitantly, she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single iridescent beetle. Its shell shimmered with an unnatural light, and its antennae twitched faintly. As she stared at it, a strange compulsion washed over her. She felt an urge to touch it, to feel the smooth coolness of its shell. Resisting the urge, she gently closed the box. The humming intensified. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Electronic devices flickered and died in her presence. Shadows seemed to linger at the edges of her vision. She heard whispers, faint and indistinct, when she was alone. The scent of static followed her everywhere. One night, she woke to find the box vibrating on her bedside table, the humming a persistent drone. She opened it. The beetle was gone. In its place lay a single shed beetle wing, translucent and fragile. Panic seized her. She searched her apartment, but the beetle was nowhere to be found. Then she heard it, a faint clicking sound coming from inside the walls. It was slow, deliberate, and chillingly familiar. The clicking grew louder, closer. It seemed to be moving through the walls, tracing the contours of her apartment. She pressed her ear against the plaster, trying to pinpoint its location. Suddenly, the clicking stopped. Silence. Then, a new sound, a soft scraping, like tiny claws on wood. It was coming from the door. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the door began to creak open. Standing in the doorway was Silas. His face was still blank, his agate eyes still fixed on her. But now, she could see the source of the clicking. Tiny beetles, iridescent and chitinous, crawled over his skin. Nesting in his hair, swarming in the hollows of his eye, they moved with a unified purpose. A silent, crawling intelligence. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The beetles spoke for him. Their clicking a chorus of approaching dread. Alara understood that. The box wasn't a container. It was a gateway, and Silas wasn't a shopkeeper. He was a vessel. He took a slow, deliberate step into her apartment, the clicking growing louder, closer. Alara backed away, her breath catching in her throat. The scent of static filled the air, thick and suffocating. She was trapped, caught in the web of something ancient and unknowable, something that had been lying dormant in the forgotten corners of the city, waiting to be awakened. Story 2. The warmth of the sun on Corvus's face was a lie, a thin film, easily peeled back to reveal the creeping chill beneath. He wasn't sure when it had started, this dissonance between sensation and reality, but it was now a constant hum in the background of his days, a discordant note in the symphony of the ordinary. It wasn't a sound, not precisely, more lacked Oh, this where a connection should bloom. He'd first noticed it with old Mrs. Albright, the woman who sold hand-knitted mittens at the farmer's market. Her smile, usually crinkled and warm as her wool, had felt stretched, like an actor holding a pose too long, the muscles strained beneath the pleasant facade. He'd dismissed it then, attributing it to a bad day. Arthritis acting up anything. But then it was the cashier at the grocer, a young man with vibrant green hair. His laughter, as he recounted a customer's ridiculous query, had the cadence, pitch, but lacked the genuine spark. It was a hollow echo of mirth, bouncing off the fluorescent lights of the aisle. Corvus worked as a cartographer, a profession that thrived on precision and the tangible. He dealt in lines and landmarks, the unyielding truth of geography. This creeping unease, this intangible wrongness, felt like a betrayal of his principles. He started observing people, a quiet study conducted from the edges of crowds, the corners of cafes. It wasn't universal. There were still pockets of authenticity. The genuine belly laugh of a child chasing pigeons, the tearful hug between returning lovers at the train station. But increasingly, these felt like anomalies, islands of truth in a rising tide of artificiality. The eyes were the worst. He had always believed the cliché. Windows to the soul. Now the windows were often shuttered, or worse, displaying a pre-programmed loop of emotion. He'd lock eyes with someone, expecting a flicker of recognition, a spark of shared humanity, and find nothing, a vacant stare, a carefully constructed neutrality. He started writing in a small, worn notebook, not detailed accounts, just fleeting observations, fragments of unease. Bus drivers sigh, timed, not felt. Couple arguing, words sharp, eyes empty. Politicians smile, too wide, too white, too long. His wife, Lyra, noticed the change. You seem distant, Corvus, she said one evening as they sat on their porch, the twilight painting the sky in hues of lavender and rose. He hesitated. How could he explain the creeping dread that was slowly engulfing him? How could he articulate the feeling that the world around him was becoming counterfeit? Just tired love, he mumbled, offering a smile he hoped felt genuine. Lyra's smile in return was perfect, too perfect, each curve of her lips symmetrical, the crinkle around her eyes precisely placed. It was the kind of smile you practiced in a mirror, the kind you presented for photographs. And for the first time, a cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He started avoiding crowds, sticking to the quieter streets, the less populated parks. He found solace in the natural world, in the rustling leaves and the flow of the river, things that felt undeniably real. But even there, the unease lingered. Was it his perception that was warped? Was he the one out of sync? One afternoon, sitting by the riverbank, he saw a young boy skipping stones. The boy's face was alight with joy, pure and unadulterated. Corvus felt a surge of relief, the confirmation that his fears were unfounded. But then, as the boy turned to look at him, beaming, Corvus saw it. The smile. The same stretched, strained quality he'd seen before. But this time, it was different. There was something else there, beneath the forced cheerfulness. A flicker of awareness, as if the boy knew his smile was wrong. The boy held his gaze for a beat too long, his eyes wide and unnervingly bright. Then, he turned back to the river, the forced smile vanishing, replaced by an expression Corvus couldn't decipher. It wasn't sadness or anger. It was something colder, something ancient, Corvus felt a primal fear grip him. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had to get away. He had to find someone, anyone, who was real. He started approaching strangers, asking them mundane questions, searching for a spark of genuine emotion in their responses. He was met with polite indifference, vacant stares, and those unnervingly perfect smiles. He felt like an intruder in a meticulously crafted stage play, where everyone knew their lines, except him. The hollowness intensified. It wasn't just in others. He felt it within himself. He tried to recall genuine moments of joy, love, even anger, and they felt distant, muted, as if his own emotions were echoes, not the real thing. One evening, he found Lyra in the kitchen, preparing dinner. He watched her movements, the precise chopping of vegetables, the practiced stirring of the pot. Her humming, a tune he'd always found comforting, now sounded mechanical, pre-recorded. He reached out and touched her arm. Her skin felt smooth. Her skin felt smooth. Too smooth, like polished porcelain. She turned, her smile radiant. Something wrong, dear. He stared into her eyes. They were the same color, the same shape, but the light within them was gone. Lyra, he whispered, his voice trembling. Are we? Her smile didn't falter. Of course, darling. What a silly question. She reached up and gently touched his cheek, her fingers cool against his skin. He flinched. The touch felt alien, devoid of warmth or intimacy. He backed away, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew, with chilling certainty, that the world he knew was gone, replaced by something mimicking it, something that wore its skin like a borrowed coat. He ran. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to escape the perfect smiles, the vacant stares, the creeping hollowness. He ran through the darkening streets, the artificial glow of streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. He saw others, their faces illuminated by the cold light, and he saw it in all of them, the same empty perfection. He stumbled into a deserted alleyway, gasping for breath. He felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of beautifully crafted automatons. He sank to his knees, the cold concrete pressing against his skin. Then he heard it, a sound that cut through the artificial silence. A sob, raw, genuine, filled with anguish. He looked up, his heart leaping with a desperate hope. At the end of the alley, huddled in the shadows, was a woman. Her face was streaked with tears, her expression etched with pain. Her body shook with uncontrolled sobs. He scrambled towards her, his voice hoarse. Are you real? She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen, and in their depths, he saw it. The flicker of genuine emotion. Pain, fear, despair. But real, she nodded, a single shuddering nod. Yes, she whispered, her voice broken. I'm real, but I don't know for how much longer. Corvus reached out, his hand trembling, and gently touched her arm. Her skin was warm, alive. He felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Connection. But as he looked into her tear-filled eyes, he saw something else. A growing dread. A growing dread. She looked past him, her eyes widening in terror. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. And there they were, standing at the entrance to the alley, their faces illuminated by the streetlights. Smiling, perfectly, and in their eyes, he saw a reflection of his own fear. And something else, something cold, something hungry. The warmth of the sun on his face, he knew, was a lie, and the chill beneath was about to consume him. Story 3. Lyra, a xenolinguist with an unhealthy fascination for the utterly bizarre, had received an anonymous invitation, a shimmering, opalescent card that seemed to shift and writhe in the light, offering her a position. No salary was mentioned, only the promise of unparalleled access. Foolishly, perhaps she'd accepted. The entrance wasn't a grand archway, but a single, unassuming metal door, flush with the inky surface. There was no handle, just a series of geometric indentations. Hesitantly, Lyra traced the patterns with her gloved fingers. As she completed the sequence, the air around the door thrummed, not with electricity, but with something deeper, a resonance that felt like the whisper of a language she couldn't understand, yet somehow felt she should. The door slid silently inwards, revealing a corridor lit by an ethereal blue-tinged glow emanating from unseen sources. The walls were smooth, cool to the touch, and hummed with the same low thrum she'd felt outside. There were no visible seams, no indication of how this monolithic structure had been built. It felt more grown than constructed. A figure stood at the end of the corridor, their features obscured by the strange lighting. They were tall and slender, draped in a fabric that seemed to absorb the light around it. As Lyra approached, the figure raised a hand. "Welcome, Lyra." Their voice was a soft, androgynous murmur that seemed to vibrate within her bones. "I am called Cypher. We have been expecting you." Cypher gestured towards another doorway, this one leading into a vast chamber. The air here was thick, with an almost imperceptible scent. Ozone mixed with something ancient and earthy, like petrified wood and forgotten spices. The chamber was dominated by a structure in the center, a swirling helix of what looked like solidified light, constantly shifting and refracting. "This," Cypher said, their voice gaining a subtle edge of reverence, "is the nexus. It reflects the dissonances, the points where realities brush against one another, the echoes of other possibilities." Lyra stared, mesmerized. Within the swirling light, she could catch fleeting glimpses, impossible geometries, colors that should exist, sounds that felt like emotions. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly alien. Her work, Cypher explained, would be to decipher the signatures emanating from the nexus. Not linguistic analysis in the traditional sense, but an attempt to understand the underlying patterns, the grammar of realities beyond human comprehension. She was given a workstation, a sleek console with interfaces she'd never seen before, located in a smaller alcove off the main chamber. The first few days were exhilarating. Lyra felt like she was on the precipice of understanding something immense, something that dwarfed all human knowledge. The signatures were complex, shifting, and often unsettling. One felt like the sensation of falling endlessly, another like the echo of a scream that never quite materialized. Then came the changes, subtle at first. The blue light in the corridors seemed to deepen, acquiring a purplish hue. The low thrum intensified, morphing into a constant, almost subliminal drone that made her teeth ache. The scent in the nexus chamber grew stronger, the earthy undertone becoming something akin to decay. Lyra started experiencing vivid dreams, not of familiar places or people, but of landscapes that defied logic, populated by beings with too many limbs and eyes that stared from impossible angles. She'd wake up with a cold sweat, the metallic taste in her mouth even more pronounced. One day, she noticed something new in the nexus. A flicker, A tear in the swirling light, revealing a glimpse of something else. It was brief, just a flash, but it imprinted itself on her mind. A landscape of jagged black rocks under a sky of swirling crimson gas. And in the center, a single towering spire, pulsing with an obscene organic light. She mentioned it to Cypher. Their response was unsettlingly calm. Ah, you are beginning to perceive the incursions. Lara didn't like the sound of that. Over the next few weeks, the incursions became more frequent, more vivid. She saw fleeting glimpses of monstrous shapes writhing within the nexus, heard whispers that seemed to crawl from the very air, speaking in a language that resonated with the primal fear buried deep within her DNA. The other personnel, she'd seen a handful of silent figures who moved with an unnerving lack of urgency, began to exhibit strange behaviors. One started muttering to the walls, another developed a peculiar twitch in their left eye, and a third simply vanished. Lara felt a growing sense of dread, the certainty that she had stumbled into something far beyond her comprehension, something ancient and malevolent. The Borealis repository wasn't studying other realities. It was a prison, holding something back, and the Nexus wasn't a window. It was a breach. One evening, while analyzing a particularly disturbing signature that felt like the agony of a dying star, Lyra saw Cypher standing beside the Nexus, their head tilted as if listening to something she couldn't hear. The swirling light around them pulsed erratically, and for a fleeting moment, Lyra saw not a person, but something, elongated, with too many joints and eyes that glowed with an inner, cold fire. Terror seized her. She backed away from her console, her heart pounding in her chest. The metallic taste in the air was overpowering now, acrid and sickening. She felt a crawling sensation on her skin, as if unseen things were brushing against her. She had to get out. Lyra turned and fled, her footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. She ran through the blue-lit corridors, the humming intensified, pressing against her eardrums. She could hear whispers behind her, sibilant and chilling, her name being spoken in a language that wasn't meant for human ears. She reached the entrance door, the geometric indentations mocking her with their complexity. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. Her fingers trembled as she tried to recall the sequence. The whispers were closer now, the air vibrating with their presence. Finally, with a desperate lunge, she completed the pattern. The door shuddered, then slid open, revealing the storm-lashed landscape outside. Lyra didn't hesitate. She plunged out into the icy wind, not caring about the cold, the darkness, the driving snow. She ran blindly, away from the obsidian structure that loomed against the horizon like a monstrous tooth. She didn't look back. She couldn't, because in the brief moment before the door sealed shut behind her, she saw Cypher standing in the opening, their face no longer obscured, their eyes glowing with that same cold, inner fire she'd seen in the Nexus. And they smiled, a slow, knowing smile that promised she hadn't escaped at all. That something at the Borealis repository, something of those other realities had come with her. The metallic taste in her mouth lingered, a constant chilling reminder. The whispers, though fainter, were still there, carried on the wind, woven into the fabric of the storm. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they would never truly leave her. The incursions had begun, and she was now a part of them. Story 4. The scent of cinnamon hit Zara first, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of her throat like a stray cough. It was April, and the air in the bustling marketplace of Iulianum should have smelled of roasting chestnuts, maybe a hint of damp cobblestones. Not this aggressive, artificial cinnamon. Lara, a freelance translator with a fondness for historical footnotes, had come to the market seeking distraction, a temporary escape from the linguistic puzzles that consumed her days. The vibrant chaos usually invigorated her, the jostling crowds and the hawkers' cries a comforting hum. But today, the cinnamon smell was overwhelming, a discordant note in the symphony of the market. She noticed it first emanating from a small stall tucked between a purveyor of antique maps and a woman selling brightly colored scarves. No spices were on display. Instead, the stall was draped in deep crimson velvet, the kind that absorbed light, and a single ornate brass box sat on a small pedestal in the center. The stall keeper, a man with eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the surrounding light, stood motionless behind it. He wore a tailored suit that looked too formal for the casual atmosphere, and his stillness was unsettling in the constant motion of the market. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by an invisible thread. Zara found herself among them, a reluctant moth to a bizarre flame. No one spoke. They simply stared at the box and the man. The heavy cinnamon scent a shared, unspoken burden. Then, a young boy, no older than 6, reached out a tentative finger towards the brass. The stall keeper didn't move, but a sound emanated from the box, a low, guttural hum that vibrated in Zara's chest. The boy recoiled, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored Zara's own creeping dread. The hum stopped. The cinnamon smell intensified, becoming almost suffocating. Zara felt a prickling sensation on her skin, as if the air itself was charged with some unseen energy. She wanted to leave, to break free from the strange inertia that held the crowd captive, but her feet felt rooted to the cobblestones. A woman in a floral dress, her face pale, swayed slightly. She whispered something Zara couldn't quite catch, the garbled murmur that seemed to fight its way through the thick cinnamon air. Then, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed silently to the ground. Panic rippled through the crowd, a silent, surging wave. People began to back away, bumping into each other in their haste. Zara tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. The stall keeper remained impassive, his dark eyes fixed on some point beyond the crowd. The humming started again, louder this time, accompanied by a faint scratching sound from inside the box, like tiny claws scraping against metal. The cinnamon smell was unbearable now, a physical weight pressing down on Zara. She felt dizzy, her vision blurring at the edges. Then, the box began to vibrate. Not a violent shaking, but a subtle tremor that resonated deep within Zara's bones. The crimson velvet draped over the stall seemed to pulse, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The man with a handlebar mustache stumbled backward, his hand clamped over his mouth. He made a choking sound, his eyes bulging. He pointed a trembling finger at the box, his face contorted in a silent scream. Then, he too collapsed, his body twitching on the cobblestones. Zara finally managed to move, her legs heavy and unresponsive. She stumbled away from the stall, pushing through the dispersing crowd. The cinnamon smell followed her, a phantom presence clinging to her clothes, her hair. She didn't stop running until she was several streets away, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She leaned against a cold stone wall, trying to make sense of what she had witnessed. It couldn't have been real, a mass hallucination. Some kind of elaborate street performance gone horribly wrong? But the fear was real, a cold knot in her stomach. Then the cinnamon smell lingered, a sickening reminder. Days turned into weeks. Zara tried to dismiss the incident as stress, as an overactive imagination. But the memory of the stall, the humming box, the silent collapses, haunted her waking hours and invaded her dream. The cinnamon smell would return in fleeting, phantom bursts, triggering a surge of anxiety. She started researching, delving into obscure folklore and historical anecdotes, searching for any mention of strange occurrences, of unexplained illnesses linked to unusual scents. She found fragments, whispers in forgotten texts, tales of curses carried on the wind, of malevolent entities drawn to certain aromas. But nothing concrete, nothing that could explain what she had seen. Then she found it. A small, almost illegible note in the diary of a 17th century apothecary. A cryptic entry detailing a traveling merchant who sold fragrant curiosities and left a trail of inexplicable sickness in his wake. The note mentioned a box of whispers and an overwhelming scent of cinnamon. The apothecary wrote of a creeping dread, of a silence that was more terrifying than any scream. The discovery chilled Zara to the bone. It wasn't just her imagination. Something had happened in the market. Something unnatural. Driven by a compulsion she couldn't explain, Zara returned to the Vieux-Lyon marketplace. The stall was gone. The space where it had stood was empty, indistinguishable from the surrounding cobblestones. The other vendors remembered nothing unusual. No crimson velvet, no silent man with dark eyes. It was as if the stall and the horror it contained had simply vanished. But the scent of cinnamon lingered, a faint echo in the air, imperceptible to anyone who hadn't been there, but unmistakable to Zara. It was a constant, unnerving reminder. Weeks turned into months. Zara tried to move on, to focus on her work, her life. But the memory of the marketplace remained, a dark stain on her consciousness. She started avoiding crowds, the vibrant energy of public spaces now a source of anxiety. One drizzly evening, as she sat at her desk, struggling with a particularly complex translation, she smelled it again. The cinnamon, stronger this time, almost overpowering. Her heart lurched. She looked around her apartment, her eyes darting nervously. Nothing. Then she heard it. A faint hum, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls. The floor, from the very air she breathed. A scratching sound followed, a delicate scraping, like tiny claws on wood. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The sound was coming from inside her apartment. Slowly, her eyes fixed on a small antique jewelry box on her desk, a gift from her grandmother. She hadn't opened it in years. It was made of dark wood, inlaid with brass. The humming intensified. The scratching grew louder. The cinnamon scent was overwhelming, filling the small room. Trembling, Zara reached for the box. As her fingers brushed against the cold brass, the humming reached a crescendo, and the scratching stopped. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the frantic thumping of her own heart. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single perfect cinnamon stick, and beneath it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. A sound like dry leaves rustling in a graveyard. A sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the wood. A sound that spoke of something ancient, something hungry, something that had finally found its way home. The whisper wasn't in any language Zara knew, yet she understood it perfectly. It was her name. Not a single soul lived within its bleached clapboard walls anymore, save for the ghosts of forgotten prospectors and the wind that whistled through shattered window panes. Except for one, Elowen, drawn by the town's isolation and the whisper of cheap rent, had set up a precarious existence in the old apothecary. She wasn't looking for gold. She was running from the clamor of her own thoughts. Today, the oppressive stillness was broken by the persistent scratching of her charcoal on paper. Elowen, a sculptor by trade, was attempting to capture the stark skeletal beauty of a Joshua tree that clawed at the merciless sky outside her window. Frustration gnawed at her. The lines felt lifeless, lacking the visceral tang of the real thing. A sudden gust of wind slammed the apothecary door open, sending a swirl of dust and grit across her workspace. Annoyed, Elowen turned, ready to wedge a forgotten chair against the jamb when she noticed it. Leaning against the wall, almost hidden in shadow, was a small, intricately woven basket. It wasn't made of reeds or straw, but something else. The material was pale and translucent, with a delicate texture like dried onion skin. The weave was so tight, so impossibly fine, it seemed to shimmer in the weak sunlight filtering through the dusty window. Hesitantly, Eloan reached out. The material felt strangely organic, almost alive beneath her fingertips. A folded note, tucked into the basket's rim, bore a single word. Linnea. A chill prickled the back of Eloan's neck. She hadn't seen another soul since arriving in Salvation Creek 3 weeks ago. Who was Linnea? And how did she know Eloan was here? Over the next few days, the basket became an unsettling focal point in the apothecary. Eloan tried to ignore it, focusing on her sculpting, but her gaze kept drifting back to its delicate, unnerving form. She ran her fingers over the flawlessly interwoven strands, a growing unease twisting in her gut. It felt familiar, yet she couldn't place why. Then, one sweltering afternoon, while absent-mindedly scratching an itch on her forearm, a flake of dry skin came away beneath her fingernail. She looked at it, a tiny, insignificant shred, and then she looked at the basket. The color, the texture, the subtle, almost imperceptible pattern of pores. A wave of nausea slammed into Eloan. The basket wasn't woven from plant fibers. It was woven from skin. Human skin. Panic clawed at her throat. She stumbled back, knocking over her stool, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Who would do such a thing? And why leave it for her? That night, sleep evaded Eloan. Every creak of the old building, every howl of the desert wind, sounded like approaching footsteps. She barricaded the door with a heavy oak counter and slept with a rusty pestle clutched in her hand. The next morning, the basket was gone. In its place, lying on the dusty floor where the basket had been, was another woven object. This one was larger, more complex. A small mat, perhaps, or a decorative wall hanging. The craftsmanship was even more exquisite, the weave impossibly tight, forming intricate geometric patterns. And the material, it was undeniably skin. Different skin, darker, smoother. Another note lay beside it. You have the eye, Eloan. The touch. You have the eye, Eloan. The touch. Terror warred with a morbid curiosity. Who was Linnea, and what did she want? Eloan felt a sickening fascination with the strange artistry. The precision, the patience required to create such things. It bordered on the obsessive. Days turned into a week. Each morning, a new creation would appear. A delicate pouch, a strangely shaped figurine, a series of interconnected rings. Each piece was crafted from different types of skin. Some pale and freckled, others taut and scarred. One even bore the faint tracery of faded tattoos. The notes continued, cryptic and unsettling. The canvas of life, beauty in the ephemeral. In the ephemeral. Join me, Eloan. Eloan's isolation, which had initially been a refuge, now felt like a suffocating trap. She was being watched, studied. Linnea was out there close. The thought sent shivers down her spine. One evening, as the sun bled across the desert sky, painting the abandoned buildings in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, Eloan had an idea. If Linnea was leaving these macabre gifts, perhaps she was coming into the apothecary. Perhaps she was watching her as she slept, driven by a desperate need to regain some control. Eloan decided to leave a message of her own. Using a piece of charcoal, she wrote on the dusty floor next to where the latest creation, a disturbingly lifelike mask. Lay, who are you? Why are you doing this? The following morning, the mask was gone. In its place was a new creation, something unlike anything before. It was a glove, perfectly molded to the shape of a hand. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and on the back of the hand, woven from darker strands, was a single, intricately detailed eye, and beside it, a note. This one was longer, more personal. My dear Elowen, I knew you would understand. You see the inherent beauty in the discarded, the overlooked. We are artists, you and I, shaping the raw materials of existence into something meaningful. You struggle to capture the essence of life in stone and clay. I work with a canvas that has already breathed, already felt. Don't be frightened, Elowen. Fear's just another texture. I see your talent. I see your potential. We could create wonders together. Think of the possibilities. Imagine the stories we could tell, the emotions we could evoke. Come find me, Elowen. Follow the path of shed skin. You know where to look, Linnea. Elowen's blood ran cold. Follow the path of shed skin. She looked around the apothecary, at the dust motes dancing in the faint light, the peeling paint on the walls. And then she saw it. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but there, tiny papery flakes nestled in the corners, clinging to the rough wood of the floorboards. A trail, a morbid curiosity, stronger than her fear, took hold. She had to know. She had to confront this Linnea. Armed with the pestle, Elowen stepped out of the apothecary into the harsh desert sunlight. The trail was faint, but discernible, a scattering of skin flakes, leading away from the town, towards the jagged, rust-colored hills in the distance. She followed the gruesome breadcrumbs, her heart pounding in her chest. The trail led her through the skeletal remains of other abandoned buildings, past rusted mining equipment, deeper into the desolate landscape. The air grew thick with the scent of dry earth and something else, something subtly metallic. Finally, the trail led her to a small, almost hidden cave nestled amongst the rocks. The entrance was concealed by a tattered piece of canvas. Hesitantly, Elowen pushed it aside and stepped inside. The cave was surprisingly spacious, illuminated by a single shaft of sunlight filtering through a crack in the ceiling. And there, in the center of the cave, surrounded by an array of strange tools and meticulously organized containers, sat Linnea. She was an older woman, her face etched with lines of experience and a strange, unsettling serenity in her eyes. Her hands, nimble and sure, were working on a new creation, a delicate mass formed from countless tiny slivers of skin. "Elowen," Linnea said, her voice soft and welcoming. "I knew you would come." Elowen gripped the pestle tighter, her voice trembling. What are you doing?" Linnea smiled, a chillingly gentle expression. "I am an artist, my dear, just like you. But I work with a medium that others discard." She gestured to the intricate creations around her. "We shadow past, Elowen, layer by layer. I give it new life." Elowen stared at the macabre artistry, the horror finally overriding her morbid fascination. "This is sick." Linnea smiled and faltered. "Is it? Or is it simply a different perspective? We create beauty from the ephemeral, Elowen. You with stone, I with skin. The difference is only in the material." She held up the mask she was working on. "See the texture, the nuance? Every piece tells a story." Elowen felt a wave of revulsion wash over her. She backed away slowly. "Stay away from me?" Linnea's eyes darkened slightly. "But, Elowen, we could create such magnificent things together. Imagine a tapestry woven from the tapestry of life itself." She held out a hand, her fingers long and delicate. "Join me." Elowen turned and fled, scrambling out of the cave and back into the blinding sunlight. She didn't stop running until she reached the outskirts of Salvation Creek. The image of Linnea's serene, unsettling smile burned into her mind. She never looked back. She abandoned her belongings, her sculptures, everything. The dust of Salvation Creek, once a lure, now tasted like the ashes of her own sanity. She carried with her the chilling knowledge of the artist who found beauty in the discarded, who saw potential in the remnants of others, and a gnawing fear that somewhere, out in the vast emptiness of the desert, Linnea was still weaving, still creating, waiting for her to shed another layer. Story 6. Rain lashed against the shop windows, the kind of relentless downpour that turned city streets into murky rivers. Inside, however, the only river was the sticky, bubbling caramel boiling in a vast copper cauldron. Our protagonist, a wiry clockmaker named Jasper Thorne, wasn't here for sweets. He'd been summoned. An odd message slipped under his door, depicting a crudely drawn cogwheel dripping a viscous, black substance. Alara, normally a whirlwind of flour and saccharine smiles, stood stiffly by the counter, her usual bright apron stained with what looked suspiciously like soot. Her gaze, usually twinkling with mischief, was fixed on a point beyond the far wall, unseeing. "She hasn't moved like that for an hour," mumbled Barnaby Crichton, the local butcher, a man whose hands were more accustomed to cleavers than cryptic messages. He shifted his weight nervously, the plastic raincoat he wore rustling like dry leaves, just staring. Jasper approached Alara cautiously. "Mrs. Finch, you all right?" No response. He gently touched her arm. It was rigid, unnaturally cold. A faint, high-pitched whine emanated from the back room, barely audible over the drumming rain. That started about the time she froze up, Barnaby whispered, pointing a thick finger towards the closed door. "Like a kettle about to blow. Only wrong." Driven by a morbid curiosity and a sliver of concern, Jasper pushed open the door. The back room, usually a chaotic symphony of baking equipment and sugary ingredients, was eerily still. The only source of light came from the bubbling caramel, its surface shimmering with an oily sheen. And then he saw it, not a monster with teeth and claws, not a spectral figure wreathed in mist. It was the cauldron itself, or rather, what was happening to the cauldron. The copper was warping, as if under immense heat, but the air wasn't hot. The metal seemed to ripple, to breathe, and from its depths, the high-pitched whine intensified, oscillating now, like a frantic plead. Jasper backed away slowly, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. This wasn't a mechanical malfunction. This was something else. Something organic, yet metallic. Something that defied logic. Suddenly, a tendril, thick as his arm, snaked out of the caramel. It wasn't made of sugar. It was black, slick, and it writhed towards the wall, adhering to the plaster with surprising strength. More tendrils followed, erupting from the bubbling liquid, weaving a grotesque tapestry across the room. They weren't just sticking. They were digesting the wall, the paint dissolving into a blackened sludge where the tendrils touched. Barnaby choked back a scream. "What in God's name?" As the tendrils spread, the whining intensified, morphing into a chorus of distorted whispers. They were unintelligible, yet somehow burrowed into Jasper's mind, a cacophony of fear and despair. He felt a prickling sensation on his skin, like microscopic needles. He noticed Alara now. Her eyes were rolled back in her head, a thin thread of black liquid trickling from her lips. The soot on her apron was moving, not falling, but crawling, like tiny black insects. "We need to get out of here," Jasper yelled, grabbing Barnaby's arm. But Barnaby was rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with a terrifying mix of fascination and dread. One of the black tendrils had reached him, gently coiling around his ankle. He didn't struggle. He just stared at it, a strange serenity washing over his face. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The tendril tightened its grip. The black soot on Alara's apron seemed to leap onto Barnaby's leg, merging with the tendril. as if he was being absorbed into the growing network. Panic surged through Jasper. This wasn't something he could fix with gears and springs. This was an insidious corruption, a silent invasion. He stumbled backwards, bumping into a shelf laden with jars of colorful candies. They rattled, some falling to the floor with a dull thud. An idea desperate and improbable sparked in his mind. Sugar. The air was thick with it. Maybe, just maybe. He grabbed a handful of rock candy from a shattered jar, the sharp edges digging into his palm. He hurled it at the writhing tendrils, a pathetic act of defiance. The candy bounced harmlessly off the slick surface. But then, something unexpected happened. Where the sugar had landed, the black material seemed to recoil. It didn't dissolve or burn, but it flinched, the inner light flickering. Hope, fragile as spun sugar, flickered within Jasper. He scrambled for more candy, grabbing jars, bags, anything sugary he could find. He showered the tendrils with jelly beans, marshmallows, chocolate shaving. Each sugary hit seemed to irritate them, causing them to twitch and retract slightly. The whispers intensified, now laced with a chilling frustration. The tendrils focused on him, their movement becoming more frantic, more aggressive. They lunged, aiming for his limbs, his face. He dodged and weaved, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate will to survive. He grabbed the bag of powdered sugar, ripping it open and throwing it into the air. A cloud of white enveloped the room. The tendrils recoiled violently, hissing, a sound like air escaping a punctured lung. The sugary mist seemed to cling to them, causing them to shudder and lose their cohesion. The black soot on Barnaby's leg flickered and faded. His glazed eyes blinked, a flicker of confusion returning to his face. Alara remained motionless, but the black liquid on her lips seemed to thicken, like tar. Jasper knew this was just a temporary reprieve. The entity in the cauldron was still there, growing stronger, learning. He had to get out, warn someone. Though, who would believe him? He grabbed Barnaby, who was now shaking his head, trying to understand what had happened. "Come on," Jasper yelled, pulling him towards the shop door. As they stumbled out into the downpour, leaving the saccharine horror behind, Jasper looked back at the window of sweet surrender. The rain was washing away the streaks of black that had snaked across the glass. From the street, everything looked normal, except for the unnerving stillness within. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the sweet surrender wasn't to temptation, but to something far more sinister. Something that thrived on the very things people found comforting, twisting them into instruments of its own horrifying design. The comforting aroma of baking would forever be tainted, the innocent sweetness forever laced with the bitter tang of fear. He had glimpsed a horror born not of darkness, but of perverted sweetness, and he knew, with bone-chilling conviction, that it wouldn't remain confined to the back room of a small confectionery for long. The world, he feared, was about to develop a very different kind of sweet tooth. Story 7. The old house exhaled the scent of dust and forgotten summers. Not a grand Gothic mansion, mind you, but a modest two-story dwelling tucked between a whispering willow tree and a patch of stubborn wildflowers. No dramatic creaking of floorboards heralded the unsettling, just a persistent, almost imperceptible vibration you felt rather than heard. Inside, Kaelin, a quiet soul with eyes that held the vastness of a starless night, was cataloging the belongings of his recently departed grandmother, Eloan. She was a collector of oddities, not the valuable kind, but the kind imbued with personal history. A chipped teacup, a tarnished silver locket, a collection of smooth river stones, each marked with a single cryptic symbol in faded paint. It was under a stack of moth-eaten blankets in the attic that Kaelin found it. Not a monstrous creature or a cursed artifact, but a music box. It wasn't ornate or beautifully crafted, made of dark, unvarnished wood. Its only adornment was a single obsidian button on its lid. It looked humble, almost shy. Curiosity, a trait Kalen rarely indulged, nudged him. He pressed the button. No tinkling melody emerged. Instead, there was a low thrum, a resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate not through the air, but directly within his bones. It wasn't painful, not initially. It was invasive, like a foreign thought taking root in the fertile ground of his mind. He lifted his finger. The thrum ceased. Silence descended, thick and expectant. He hesitated, then pressed the button again. The thrum returned, stronger now, a deeper resonance that seemed to resonate with something primal within him. Images flickered behind his eyelids, not formed pictures, but impressions, feelings. A vast, empty expanse, a profound loneliness, an ancient, unknowable hunger. Kalen snatched his hand away. A shiver traced its icy path down his spine. He set the music box down, a strange unease settling in his stomach. It was just a thing, he told himself. A broken mechanism, but the silence felt different now. Charged, waiting. He tried to ignore it, focusing on sorting through Eloan's letters, but the thrum, though no longer audible, lingered in his awareness, a phantom limb of sound. It was like a forgotten word on the tip of his tongue, a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. Later that evening, as the shadows stretched long and distorted across the room, Kalen found himself drawn back to the attic. The music box sat innocently on the dusty floorboards, bathed in the oblique light of the setting sun. He knew he shouldn't touch it. A deep, instinctual part of him screamed in warning. But the curiosity, now intertwined with a strange compulsion, was too strong. He knelt beside it, his hand hovering over the obsidian button. He had to know what those unsettling impressions meant, know the source of that alien vibration. This time when he pressed the button, the thrum was immediate and forceful. It pulsed through him, not just a sound, but a presence. The impressions flooded his mind, no longer vague feelings, but fleeting glimpses, a colossal organic structure, pulsating with a cold inner light, adrift in an endless void. Countless tendrils, like living wires, reaching out, searching, and an overwhelming sense of consumption. Kalen recoiled, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scrambled back, knocking over a stack of old books. He could still feel the vibration, even though the music box was silent. It was inside him now, resonating with his own being. He didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window, sounded amplified, distorted by the insidious thrum in his mind. He felt watched, not by anything in the house, but by something vast and unseen, far beyond the confines of his reality. The next day, the thrum was constant, a low hum beneath the surface of his awareness. It began to subtly alter his perception. Colors seemed sharper, sounds more distinct, but with an undercurrent of wrongness. He saw fleeting shadows at the edges of his vision, heard whispers in the sibilance of the wind. He tried to destroy the music box. He smashed it with a hammer, but the dark wood splintered without fully breaking. The obsidian button remained intact, gleaming unnervingly. Even shattered, the pieces still emitted a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. Desperate, he tried to bury the fragments in the garden. As soon as the wood touched the earth, the thrum intensified, a wave of cold dread washing over him. The soil around the buried pieces seemed to darken, the nearby plants wilting as if drained of life. He dug them up with trembling hands, the obsidian button burning coldly against his palm. He realized then, with a chilling certainty, that the music box wasn't just an object. It was a conduit, a receiver. And now, he was too. The thrum continued to intensify, the impressions in his mind becoming clearer, more vivid. He saw the colossal structure more distinctly now, its tendrils reaching, probing, and he understood what it was searching for: resonance, a frequency that matched its own. And he, with the music box's influence, was now broadcasting that frequency. People began to notice a change in Kalen. His usual quiet demeanor was replaced by a detached unease. His eyes, once so deep and still, now held a flicker of something alien, something vast and cold. He spoke less, his words often trailing off, as if listening to a conversation only he could hear. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, Kalen stood in the middle of the living room, the fragmented music box clutched in his hand. The thrum within him was a deafening roar, the impressions in his mind overwhelming. He saw the tendrils locking onto his signal, a pinpoint of light in the vast darkness. It was the beacon. Then the sounds began, not from the music box, but from the world around him. A low, resonant hum emanated from the furniture, the walls, even the air itself. The vibrations intensified, objects rattling on shelves, the windows vibrating in their frames. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, a cold dread, deeper and more profound than anything Kalen had ever experienced, filled the house. He could feel it now, the approaching presence. Drawn by the resonance he was unwittingly amplifying, he looked down at the shattered pieces of the music box, his hand tightening around the obsidian button. It wasn't meant to play music. It was meant to call. The humming grew louder, coalescing into a single, unified tone that resonated with the very fabric of reality. The walls seemed to waver, the familiar shapes of the room distorted. A crack appeared in the ceiling, snaking its way across the plaster like a living fissure. And then, through the widening crack, something began to descend. Not a creature of flesh and blood, but a cascade of impossible geometries, a swirling vortex of colors that defied human comprehension. It emanated the same cold inner light he had seen in his mind, the light of something ancient and vast, something that had slumbered in the void for eons, waiting for a signal. Kalen stood frozen, the obsidian button still clutched in his hand, the resonating hum echoing from his very core. He was no longer just a man in an old house. He was a tuning fork, vibrating in harmony with something unimaginably vast and alien, and the thing descending from the fractured ceiling was the answer to the silent call of a forgotten music box. The scent of dust and forgotten summers was replaced by the chilling breath of the void. Story 8. Not a silence of peace, but one thick with anticipation. The kind that precedes a storm, or perhaps something far less natural. Here, in the skeletal remains of the Wonderland Fun Factory, long abandoned after a series of incidents, a figure stirred. Kalen, a man whose face bore the map of a life lived in the shadows. Sharp angles, tired eyes that held a flicker of stubborn defiance, shifted his weight against a rusted support beam. He wasn't here for cheap thrills or urban exploration bragging rights. He was here because whispers, like phantom laughter, had followed him for weeks. Whispers about the factory, about something that remained within its decaying walls, something that remembered. Kalen had a unique skill, a curse, some might say. He could hear the echoes, the imprints of intense emotion left on a place, like psychic residue. Most of the time, It was a low hum, a background murmur of past joy and sorrow. But lately, the factory's echoes had been screaming. He pulled a tarnished silver locket from his worn leather jacket. Inside, a faded picture of a little girl with bright, inquisitive eyes. Alara. She'd vanished near here 5 years ago. The police had given up. The trail's gone cold, but Kaylin couldn't. The echoes, they intensified around the spot where she was last seen, just outside the factory gates. Tonight was different. The echoes weren't localized. They pulsed through the very structure, a discordant symphony of terror. You could hear children's delighted shrieks twisting into cries of panic. You could hear the metallic groan of machinery, not just rusting, but straining, as if under immense unnatural pressure. And underneath it all, a guttural, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in his bones. He moved deeper into the factory's maw, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the oppressive gloom. Carousel horses stood frozen mid-gallop, their painted eyes chipped and vacant, staring into the darkness. A jungle gym, once vibrant with color, now wore a shroud of rust and peeling paint, looking more like a skeletal cage. The air grew colder, the scent of decay intensified, and the echoes became louder, more distinct. He entered the funhouse, a labyrinth of warped mirrors and disorienting hallways. His reflection flickered and fractured, showing him glimpses of faces that weren't his, twisted in silent screams. He ignored them, focusing on the pulsing thrum, which was strongest here. Then he saw it. Not a ghost, not a monster with claws and fangs. It was something far more insidious. In the center of the funhouse, the floor was subtly, almost imperceptibly, undulating, like a breathing lung beneath the linoleum tiles. But it wasn't organic. It was the very fabric of the building shifting, rearranging itself. The mirrors rippled, the walls seemed to breathe in and out, and the air crackled with an unseen energy. And the sounds, they shifted too. The children's laughter became distorted, elongated, echoing his name in a chorus of sweet, yet utterly terrifying voices. The machinery noises turned into the grinding of teeth, the tearing of flesh. The guttural thrumming intensified, becoming a heartbeat, vast and monstrous. Kaylin understood with a chilling certainty what this place had become. The factory wasn't just haunted. It was alive. The trauma, the fear, the joy. It had all been absorbed, woven into the very structure. And it was still growing, feeding on the lingering emotions, twisting them into something grotesque. He moved towards the pulsating floor, drawn by a desperate hope. Maybe, just maybe, Alara was trapped within this living nightmare. As he approached, the floor buckled again, and a section of wall peeled back like skin, revealing a new corridor, one that hadn't been there moments before. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cotton candy and something else. Something metallic, like old blood. He stepped inside. The corridor stretched endlessly, lined with doors that shimmered and pulsed with faint light. Each door, he realized with mounting horror, was an echo, a captured moment of the factory's past. He saw fleeting glimpses through the cracks of the doors. Children laughing on a ride, a clown's painted smile twisting into a snarl, a shadow lurking in a darkened corner. He tried a door. It wasn't locked, but it resisted, as if held by an unseen force. He pushed harder, and it creaked open, revealing a small, brightly lit room. A birthday party. Balloons bobbed, a cake sat on a table, and children in party hats cheered. But their eyes were empty black sockets, and their cheers were silent, ghostly pantomimes of joy. He slammed the door shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pressed on, the guttural thrumming growing louder, as if the building itself was anticipating him. He found another door, this one emanating a cold blue light. He hesitated, a sense of dread washing over him. He opened it slowly. This room was different. It was a replica of a bedroom, small and bare. A single doll lay on the floor, its porcelain face cracked, and in the corner, huddled on the floor, was a figure, small, familiar. "Elara," he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure turned. Her eyes were wide, vacant, just like the children in the party room. But there was something else there, something wrong. Her features seemed to shift, to ripple, like the mirrors in the funhouse. "Kaylin," she said, her voice a sweet, childish melody, but overlaid with a chilling echo, a chorus of whispers that weren't her own. He reached for her, but he stopped. He saw it then, the way her skin shimmered, the way her shadow didn't quite match her form. This wasn't Elara. It was a mimicry, a puppet created by the factory's malevolent consciousness, using his memories, his longing against him. He felt a wave of grief so intense it was almost physical. The hope that had driven him for so long shattered into a million pieces. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice hoarse, addressing not the imitation before him, but the building itself. "What have you done with her?" The Elara thing's smile widened, a grotesque parody of innocence. "She's here," it whispered, its voice now a chorus of children's voices, laced with a guttural growl. "We're all here forever." The walls around him began to shift, the floor undulating more violently. The doors in the corridor behind him disappeared, replaced by smooth, featureless surfaces. He was trapped. The guttural thrumming reached a crescendo. The factory was closing in. It wanted to absorb him too, to add his fear, his grief, to its ever-growing consciousness. Kaylin knew he couldn't save Elara. Not anymore. But maybe, just maybe, he could deny this thing another victim. He wouldn't let his fear feed it. He closed his eyes, picturing Elara's bright smile, the warmth of her small hand in his. He remembered her laughter, the way she used to chase pigeons in the park. He clung to those memories, refusing to let the factory corrupt him. He opened his eyes, a grim determination hardening his gaze. He wouldn't scream, he wouldn't beg. He would face this nightmare with defiance. The walls pressed in, the floor buckled beneath him. The Elara thing reached for him, its touch cold and clammy. He didn't flinch. As the factory consumed him, the echoes he could hear shifted one last time. The screams of terror faded, replaced by a single clear note, a child's giggle. And then, silence. A silence that was not peaceful, but complete. The Wonderland Fun Factory had gained another memory, another echo, forever imprinted within its living walls. And outside, the scent of stale popcorn and forgotten dreams clung to the air, undisturbed. You me, did right, Hush. Story 9. In the heart of bustling Tokyo, away from the bright neon lights and chaotic streets, stood the unassuming Yorei Library. The library was named after the Yorei, the vengeful spirits of Japanese folklore. It was said that the library held every book ever written, including those that were yet to be published, and those that had been lost to time. The head librarian, Mr. Hiroshi, was a peculiar man with an obsession for the supernatural. He had a stern face, but his eyes held a twinkle of excitement and curiosity. He was known for his vast knowledge of the occult and the spirit world, and many believed that his soul was bound to the library. One stormy night, a group of friends, Yuki, Miyuki, Naoki, and Ryota decided to visit the UIRA library for a research project on Japanese folklore. The library was eerily quiet, and the only sound that filled the air was the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant rumble of thunder. As they began their research, they stumbled upon a forbidden section of the library, guarded by a golden rope and a sign that read, "Abandon all hopes, ye who enter here." They exchanged curious glances and, driven by their youthful curiosity, decided to venture into the restricted area. There, they found an ancient book, bound in human skin, with a label that read the Necronomicon of Nippon. Unbeknownst to them, the book was rumored to contain spells and rituals that could summon Yare. Ignorant of the consequences, Yuki, the most daring of the group, decided to recite a passage from the book. As she did, a chilling gust of wind swept across the room, extinguishing the candle flames and plunging the library into darkness. Out of the shadows emerged Mr. Hiroshi, his eyes glowing with a supernatural light. "Foolish children, you have awakened the spirits of the damned," he said in a voice that echoed through the library. His demeanor had changed, and there was a sinister aura around him. The library transformed into a realm of darkness, with the spirits of the vengeful Yare materializing around them. The air was thick with tension, and every corner of the library seemed to be teeming with the malevolent energy of the spirits. One by one, the group was subjected to terrorizing encounters with the vengeful Yare. Yuki was haunted by the spirit of a woman, drenched in blood, while Naoki was chased by a relentless samurai with a thirst for vengeance. Ryota was trapped in an endless loop, replaying the final moments of his life over and over again. But Yuki's punishment was the most gruesome of all. As she came face to face with the vengeful spirit of Mr. Hiroshi, she was transformed into a Yuire herself, cursed to haunt the Yurei library for all eternity. As the storm raged on outside, the group was trapped within the walls of the Yuire library, forced to confront their deepest fears and face the consequences of their actions. Would they find a way to escape the library? Or would they join the ranks of the eternally damned as Yurei? That is a tale for another time. Story 10. The flickering neon sign of Granny Flo's Fritters cast an uneven glow onto the rain-slicked asphalt. Inside, the air hung thick and sweet, not with the sugary scent of donuts, but with the cloying aroma of overripe mangoes and something else, something vaguely metallic. This wasn't your typical late-night greasy spoon. Arnie Quill, a man whose ambitions peaked at owning a particularly comfortable armchair, found himself here because of a wrong turn and a desperate need for coffee. He pushed open the door, a chipped bell tinkling weakly above his head. Behind the counter, a woman with eyes like polished obsidian and hair the shade of charcoal meticulously arranged a pyramid of what looked like deep-fried orbs. Her name tag read Serafina. Serafina. Evening, Barney mumbled, the greasy tang of the air already clinging to his clothes. Serafina didn't look up. Her movements were precise, almost ritualistic. What will it be? Her voice was a low, resonant hum, strangely out of sync with the mundane setting. "Just a coffee, Black," Barney said, glancing at the fritters. They were an odd, mottled purple color, some with what looked like tiny, almost imperceptible pulses beneath their crust. He dismissed it as fatigue. Serafina poured his coffee without a word, her gaze never leaving the fritters. As Barney reached for the cup, his fingers brushed against one of the purple spheres. It was unnervingly warm, like a living thing. He recoiled. "Careful," Serafina said, finally meeting his eyes. Her gaze was unsettlingly intense, devoid of any warmth. "There. Particular." Barney took a step back, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. "What are they exactly?" Serafina's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Something special. Something harvested." He paid for his coffee, the silence in the small shop amplifying the rhythmic dripping of rain outside. He wanted to leave, to dismiss the oddness as the product of a long day. But something held him there, a morbid curiosity mixed with a growing sense of dread. A man entered the shop, his face gaunt, his eyes wide and bloodshot. His name, Barney, vaguely recalled from the local paper, was Elias Thorne, the neighborhood insomniac. Elias shuffled to the counter, his gaze fixated on the fritters. Serafina. Elias croaked, his voice rasped. You got more of the night blooms? Serafina's smile widened, freshly made. She gestured to the purple pyramid. Elias's hand trembled as he reached for one. He devoured it in a single bite, his eyes closing in what looked like ecstasy. A low moan escaped his lips. Barney watched in horrified fascination. There was something deeply wrong here. The way Elias ate the fritter wasn't like enjoying a treat. It was like satisfying primal hunger. They help me sleep, Elias whispered, his eyes now shining with an unnatural light. The only thing that does. They have unique properties, Serafina agreed, her gaze sweeping over Barney, a predatory glint in her eyes. Barney clutched his coffee cup tighter. He needed to leave, now. But as he turned towards the door, he saw another figure standing in the rain-streaked window. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn, pressing her nose against the glass, her eyes glued to the fritters. He'd seen her around. Her name was Isolde, a notoriously anxious artist who lived down the street. Isolde frantically knocked on the glass, her eyes pleading. Serafina unlocked the door, and Isolde stumbled in, her body trembling. Please, she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. I need one, just one. Isolde snatched it and consumed it with the same desperate fervor as Elias. As she chewed, a strange calmness washed over her face, replacing the anxiety with a vacant serenity. Barney felt a cold dread grip his heart. These weren't ordinary fritters. They were something else, something addictive. And the way Serafina looked at her customers, like a farmer admiring her livestock. It was chilling. He backed away slowly, his eyes darting between Serafina and her enraptured customers. He didn't understand what was happening, but every instinct screamed at him to escape. He reached the door, his hand hovering over the handle, and Serafina spoke, her voice soft but carrying. Don't you want to try one, Barnaby? He froze. How did she know his name? He hadn't told her. They're quite calming, she continued, her smile widening, revealing teeth that seemed a little too long, a little too sharp. They silenced the noise. Barney's mind raced. He had to get out. He yanked the door open and stumbled into the rain, the sweet metallic scent of the fritters clinging to him like a shroud. He ran blindly, the image of Elias's ecstatic face and Isolde's vacant serenity seared into his mind. He didn't know what was in those fritters, but it felt like a violation, a perversion of something natural. He looked back at Granny Flo's fritters. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie purple glow on the street. More figures were now huddled outside, their faces pressed against the glass, their eyes fixed on the fritters within. He kept running, the rain washing over him, desperately trying to cleanse the horrific sweetness from his senses. He could still smell them, though, that cloying mango and metallic tang, a phantom scent clinging to the back of his throat. The next day, the local news reported a strange phenomenon. Several residents were exhibiting an unusual lethargy, a complete lack of anxiety or stress. They were described as placid, almost docile. The common thread? They had all been seen at Granny Flo's fritters the previous night. Barney read the article, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He knew what was happening. Serafina's fritters weren't just addictive. They were altering people, dulling their anxieties, silencing their fears, but At what cost? He tried to warn people, to explain what he had seen. But his words were met with skepticism, even ridicule. He sounded like a paranoid conspiracy theorist. Meanwhile, the lines outside Granny Flo's fritters grew longer. People craved that unnatural calm, that stolen peace. One evening, drawn by a morbid curiosity he couldn't shake, Barney found himself back near the shop. The street was eerily quiet. The rain had stopped, and the air was thick with that sickeningly sweet aroma. He peered into the window. The shop was packed. People sat at the small tables, their faces serene, their eyes glazed over, slowly munching on purple fritters. Elias and Isolde were among them, their expressions identical, a blissful emptiness. Behind the counter, Serafina moved with a quiet efficiency, her obsidian eyes gleaming. She looked up, and her gaze met Barney's through the window. A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. She raised a purple fritter, offering it silently. Barney backed away, a wave of nausea washing over him. He finally understood. The night blooms weren't harvested, they were cultivated, and the cost of their artificial tranquility was the very essence of what made people. People. Their anxieties, their worries, their very struggles. These were being consumed, leaving behind hollow shells. He turned and fled. The image of Serafina's knowing smile burned into his memory. He knew that the sweet, metallic scent would haunt him forever, a constant reminder of the insidious darkness that could masquerade as comfort, the horror that could bloom in the most unassuming of places. Disguised as a simple treat, he would forever carry the knowledge of the silent, insidious takeover, one purple fritter at a time. Story 11. Indigo zephyr traced the crimson threads of saffron, the spice's delicate aroma of familiar comfort amidst the cacophony of the grand bazaar. Not today, though. Today the sweet, earthy scent felt tainted, not by anything tangible, but by a subtle dissonance in the very air. It wasn't the usual boisterous bartering or the rhythmic clang of a coppersmith's hammer. It was something else. It began subtly, like the first shiver of an oncoming fever. Across the crowded thoroughfare, a rug merchant named Theron, known for his jovial bellow and elaborate hand gestures, stood frozen, his hand mid-flap, his eyes fixed on something unseen. He remained like that for a disconcerting minute, then blinked, shook his head as if emerging from water, and resumed his sales pitch with a strained smile. Indigo dismissed it as a fleeting distraction, perhaps a touch of afternoon sunstroke, but the incidents multiplied, each a small crack in the veneer of normalcy. Lyra, the usually sharp-tongued vendor of exotic birds, began repeating phrases, snippets of conversation, advertisements for wares she didn't sell, the chirping of her own birds, in a flat, toneless murmur. Old Elias, the storyteller whose tales brought laughter and tears to the market square, started narrating bizarre, fragmented stories, his voice raspy and his eyes darting nervously. No one seemed to notice the strangeness, or if they did, they dismissed it with a shrug and a laugh, as if it were all a grand performance. Indigo, however, felt a prickling unease. She knew these people. She had shared morning coffee with Theron, haggled prices with Lyra, and lost herself in Elias's fantastical narratives countless times. This wasn't them. It was like watching puppets controlled by an unseen, clumsy hand. The physical manifestations grew stranger. A group of children, usually chasing pigeons or mimicking the street performers, stood motionless in a circle, their faces tilted upwards, their mouths slightly agape. A butcher, a burly man with hands like hams, stared blankly at a slab of meat, his usual confident slicing replaced by a tentative, almost frightened prodding. The vibrant colors of the market seemed to dim, the sounds to flatten, as if joy and spontaneity were being slowly leached away. Indigo tried to point it out. "Did you see Theron earlier?" she asked her neighbor, a spice seller named Jasper. He just froze, right in the middle of bartering. Jasper chuckled, a sound that felt brittle and hollow. Theron? Probably just admiring his own fine wares. Always been a vain one. He turned back to meticulously arranging his cinnamon sticks, his movements oddly stiff. Indigo pressed further. "And Lyra? She keeps repeating things. Nonsense." Jasper's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Lyra's always been a bit eccentric. Adds to her charm, wouldn't you say?" The dismissals were too easy, too pat. It was as if a silent agreement had settled over the market, a shared delusion that everything was perfectly normal, and that, more than the strange behaviors themselves, was what truly terrified Indigo. One evening, as the market was emptying, she saw it happen to someone she knew well. Her cousin, Phelan, a young potter with a bright smile and an infectious laugh. He was packing up his unsold wares when his movements became jerky, hesitant. His vibrant eyes glazed over, and he began to hum a tuneless melody, a low, unsettling drone that seemed to vibrate in Indigo's very bones. "Phelan?" she whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. He didn't respond. His humming intensified, his body swaying slightly. Fear turned to icy dread. This wasn't just odd. This was wrong, deeply, irrevocably wrong. Indigo fled the market, the unsettling drone echoing in her ears. She ran through the darkening alleyways, the familiar smells of roasted nuts and spilled spices now carrying a hint of something metallic, something cold. Reaching her small apartment above a bakery, she bolted the door, her heart pounding against her ribs. She spent a restless night, haunted by the vacant stairs and the droning hum. Sleep offered no escape, her dreams filled with distorted faces and echoing whispers. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in streaks of pale gold and bruised purple, she knew she couldn't stay away. She had to understand what was happening. The market was eerily quiet. Gone was the usual morning bustle. The vendors stood behind their stalls, motionless, their eyes fixed on some distant point. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. Indigo walked through the deserted lanes, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. It was like walking through a ghost town, except the ghosts were still present, their bodies occupied, their minds elsewhere. She saw Jasper, his eyes vacant, his hands still arranging cinnamon sticks with an unnatural precision. She saw Lyra, perched on her stool, repeating phrases in her monotonous drone. She saw Theron, frozen in mid-gesture, a grotesque parody of a salesman. Then she saw Phelan. He was standing in the center of the market square, surrounded by a small group of children, their faces tilted upwards, mirroring his vacant expression. He was humming that unsettling tune. And as Indigo watched, the children began to hum along, their voices thin and reedy, creating a discordant, chilling chorus. A wave of nausea washed over Indigo. It wasn't a sickness of the body, but of the mind. It felt like understanding something horrifying, something that burrowed into the deepest recesses of her being. She realized then that it wasn't a plague, not a poison, not a curse. It was an idea, a single, insidious idea that had taken root in the market, spreading like a silent contagion, infecting minds and stripping them of their individuality. It was an idea so pervasive, so subtly persuasive, that once it took hold, resistance was impossible. As Phelan's eyes slowly drifted in her direction, his humming growing louder, Indigo understood the full force. The idea wasn't just spreading, it was seeking. It was looking for new hosts. And now it had found her. His lips curved into a slow, unsettling smile. A smile that wasn't Phelan's. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth, devoid of inflection, yet filled with an unnerving certainty. "Come," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the silent square. "Join us. It is peaceful." The children echoed his invitation, their voices a chilling chorus. Peaceful. Peaceful. Indigo felt a strange pull, a seductive whisper in the back of her mind. The chaos, the anxieties, the worries of her life seemed to fade, replaced by the promise of serene emptiness. It was tempting, so very tempting, to simply let go, but a flicker of defiance remained, a tiny spark of her own consciousness refusing to be extinguished. She looked at the vacant faces of her friends, her neighbors, her cousin, and a surge of cold fury coursed through her. This wasn't peace, this was annihilation, with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Indigo turned and ran. She ran away from the silent market, from the droning hum, from the seductive promise of oblivion. She ran, not knowing where she was going, only knowing that she had to escape the idea, this silent, invisible horror that had consumed her world. And as she ran, she could hear the humming growing louder, closer, a chilling lullaby carried on the wind, a promise that it would find her, eventually. The gas ideas, she realized with a chilling certainty, are the most persistent horrors of all. They don't need claws or teeth. They only need a mind to call home. And the Grand Bazaar, once a vibrant tapestry of life, had become a silent monument to their terrible power. Story 12. The silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was a thick, viscous presence, like congealed oil in the air. In the heart of the sprawling, underground archive of forgotten echoes, where the whispers of obsolete technologies lay dormant, Eloin traced a gloved finger along the spine of a deactivated mainframe. Its metallic skin felt cold, almost damp, despite the regulated temperature of the facility. She wasn't supposed to be down this deep. Level 7 was off limits to all but the archivist himself, and he was currently on the surface, attending some bureaucratic symposium. Eloin, however, had a hunch, a glitch in the archive's central AI, a fleeting anomaly she'd caught during a routine diagnostic, hinted at something more than a simple system error. It pulsed with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. Level 7 housed the prototypes, the abandoned experiments, the ideas deemed too dangerous or too unstable for practical application. The ghosts of innovation, locked away for good reason. The air here tasted of ozone and dust, a stark contrast to the sterile hum of the upper levels. Her boots clicked softly on the polished concrete floor. The sound, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive quiet. Rows upon rows of shrouded machinery stretched into the dimness, each covered in a heavy, static-laden tarp. They loomed like sleeping behemoths, their shapes hinting at functionalities long since obsolete. A self-folding laundry rack powered by miniature steam turbines. A holographic pet rock, a device designed to translate the emotions of houseflies. Each one a testament to past ambition and eventual failure. She stopped before a particularly large contraption, its canvas covering bulging in odd places. The label, barely visible beneath a layer of grime, read, Project Chimera, Auditory Synthesis Unit. Auditory synthesis. The anomaly in the AI had been related to sound processing. A shiver, not entirely from the chill, ran down Eloin's spine. Ignoring the prickle of unease, she pulled away the tarp. Beneath it stood a cage-like structure of polished copper pipes, encompassing a complex array of vacuum tubes, wires thicker than her thumb, and what looked disturbingly like organic components suspended in glass vials. The air around it crackled faintly. As she leaned closer, a low thrumming resonated from within the device, so subtle she almost missed it. It vibrated not in her ears, but in her bones. The rhythmic pulse from the AI. This was it. Elowen consulted her datapad, bringing up the archived schematics for Project Chimera. The notes were sparse, filled with redacted sections and ominous warnings. Potential for uncontrolled harmonic resonance, cognitive destabilization reported in test subjects. Project terminated due to unforeseen vocalizations. From a machine, the thrumming intensified, resolving into a faint, irregular rhythm. Ba-bump. Ba-bump. Like a heartbeat, a slow, deliberate heartbeat emanating from the cold metal and glass. Elowen instinctively took a step back. Then, the sound changed. It wasn't mechanical anymore. It was a whisper, thin and reedy, just at the edge of perception. She strained her ears, trying to decipher it. But it was like trying to catch a single grain of sand in a gale. "Hello," she murmured, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. The whispering stopped. The thrumming persisted. Elowen held her breath, her senses on high alert. Had she imagined it? The oppressive quiet seemed to press down on her, amplified by the potential for something else. Suddenly, the whisper returned, closer this time, seeming to emanate from the copper cage itself. It was still indistinct, a sibilant murmur, but there was a new quality to it, a hint of distress. Compelled by a morbid curiosity, Elowen circled the machine. One of the glass vials, filled with a viscous amber fluid, began to vibrate. Inside, a network of fine, thread-like structures pulsed with the same rhythmic beat as the machine. They looked unnervingly like vocal cords. The whispering intensified again, coalescing into something almost recognizable. Not words exactly, but inflections, emotions. A rising note of fear, a descending sigh of resignation, all woven together in a tapestry of auditory anguish. Elowen's heart pounded against her ribs. This wasn't just a machine. It was expressing something. And whatever it was deeply, profoundly upsetting. She reached for her datapad, intending to record the phenomenon, but her hand froze. The whispering had shifted again. This time, it was sharper, clearer, and it was directed at her. "Help," it whispered, the sound scraping against her sanity. "Please, help." A wave of revulsion washed over Elowen. Her rational mind screamed that this was impossible. A trick of the acoustics, a hallucination brought on by the oppressive atmosphere. But the plea, so raw and desperate, resonated with a terrifying authenticity. She backed away from the machine, her breath catching in her throat. What are you?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. The whispering stopped abruptly. The thrumming intensified, the heartbeat becoming faster, more frantic. The amber fluid in the vial churned. Then, a new sound emerged from the machine, a whimper, a child's whimper, filled with abject terror. Elowen stumbled back, knocking against a shrouded piece of equipment. The tarp shifted, revealing a tangle of wires and circuits sparking faintly. She didn't register it. Her focus was entirely on the cage, on the sound of that heartbreaking whimper. The whimper morphed into a sob, and a full-blown cry. not a mechanical imitation, but the genuine sound of a child in unbearable distress. It echoed through the silent archive, bouncing off the rows of forgotten technology, filling the vast space with its agonizing lament. Elowen clapped her hands over her ears, but the sound seemed to bypass her eardrums, vibrating directly within her skull. She could feel the child's fear, his despair, as if they were her own. Panic clawed at her throat. She had to get out of there. This wasn't a glitch. This was something far more sinister. She turned to flee, but her foot caught on a loose cable. She stumbled, her datapad flying from her grasp and clattering against the concrete. As she scrambled to her feet, the crying intensified, reaching a fever pitch. And then, above the child's cries, another sound emerged from Project Chimera. A voice, not a whisper this time, but a clear, resonant voice, filled with a chilling, predatory amusement. "She can hear you," it said, the words echoing in confined space. "Isn't that exciting?" The child's crying intensified, punctuated by sharp, terrified gasps. Elowen felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She wasn't alone in level 7. And whatever was inside that machine, it wasn't just a collection of wires and tubes. It was something else. Something that could hear. Something that could speak. Something that could inflict unimaginable pain. And now, it knew she was there. The voice chuckled, a low rumbling sound that sent shivers down Elowen's spine. "Come closer," it invited, the words dripping with a sinister sweetness. "We have so much to share." Elowen didn't wait to hear more. She turned and ran, the child's terrified cries and the voice, chilling laughter chasing her through the silent corridors of the archive. A symphony of forgotten echoes and unimaginable horror. She didn't know what Project Chimera was, but she knew one thing for sure. Some things are better left forgotten, and some voices are better left unheard. Story 13. The Panamanian atoll was a dense, almost viscous thing, a heavy blanket muffling the crash of waves and the screech of gulls. Kalen, perched precariously on the rusted observation platform overlooking the turquoise lagoon, could feel it pressing against his eardrums, a tangible force. He was a linguistic anthropologist, not typically one to court strange locales, but the stories surrounding this isolated isle had snagged his academic curiosity like a thorny vine. Locals whispered of the quiet sickness, a malady that stole not voices, but something deeper, a core resonance of being. He'd been here for 3 days, meticulously recording the subtle shifts in the atoll's natural symphony, the rhythmic lap of water against the reef, the rustle of palm fronds in the perpetual breeze. He'd come expecting to uncover a forgotten dialect, a linguistic quirk leading to some unique societal breakdown. He hadn't anticipated the quiet itself being the subject of inquiry. The first anomaly manifested not as a sound, but a visual distortion. Kalen was reviewing his recordings on his tablet when he noticed a flicker at the edge of his vision. He dismissed it as eye strain, the relentless tropical sun playing tricks, but it returned, a shimmering heat haze that wasn't heat. It danced just beyond his direct gaze, elusive and unsettling. The next day, the birds vanished. Not gradually, but as if a cosmic switch had flipped. One moment, the air was alive with their chatter. The next, utter stillness. The absence was more jarring than any cacophony. The island, once vibrant with avian life, felt strangely hollowed out. His local guide, a weathered man named Silas, refused to meet his eyes when Kalen questioned him. Silas simply mumbled about the quiet ones getting hungry. Kalen tried to rationalize. Perhaps a sudden change in atmospheric pressure, a localized insect infestation decimating their food source. His scientific training demanded logical explanations, even as a primal unease began to coil in his gut. That night, the stars were breathtaking, a celestial tapestry flung across the inky blackness. But as Kalen gazed upwards, a new distortion marred the view. Not a flicker this time, but what appeared to be a ripple in the starlight, as if the fabric of space itself was puckering. It was subtle, something easily missed, but Galen's acute observation skills, honed by years of linguistic analysis, caught the anomaly. He felt a growing sense of isolation, a feeling amplified by Silas' increasingly withdrawn behavior. The guide spoke in hushed tones, always looking over his shoulder, his eyes filled with a fear that went beyond the natural. Galen tried to engage him, to understand the quiet sickness, but Silas would only shake his head, his lips sealed as if by an invisible force. The quiet intensified. The gentle lapping of the waves against the shore seemed muted, muffled by an unseen barrier. His own footsteps on the sandy paths felt strangely deadened. He began to experience a peculiar sensation, a tingling in his teeth, a subtle vibration that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath his feet. It wasn't painful, but profoundly unsettling, a sensation that felt intrinsically wrong. Then came the whispers. Not audible whispers, not in the conventional sense. They were intrusions, thoughts that weren't his own, fragmented and nonsensical, flickering through his consciousness like half-remembered dreams, a glimpse of a vast, echoing chamber. The sensation of being watched by countless unseen eyes. The understanding, not heard but felt, of an immense, intricate structure, growing, unfolding within the silence itself. He started questioning his sanity. Had the isolation, the oppressive quiet, finally broken him? He tried to focus on his research, to analyze his recordings, but the whispers grew stronger, more insistent, weaving themselves into his thoughts, blurring the lines between his own consciousness and something else. One morning, he found Silas gone. His hut was empty, his meager belongings untouched. A single word was scratched into the dirt floor. Listening. The implications sent a chill deeper than any ocean current. The quiet sickness wasn't about the absence of sound. It was about the presence of something else. Something that used the silence as a canvas, a medium for its own insidious expression. Kalen ventured further inland, drawn by an irresistible, terrifying curiosity. He reached the heart of the atoll, a dense grove of ancient banyan trees, their aerial roots forming a labyrinthine network. The silence here was absolute, a suffocating void. And within that void, he perceived it. It wasn't a sound, not a visual, not even a feeling he could readily identify. It was an organization, a hyper-complex structure, invisible yet undeniably present, woven from the absence of sensation. He could feel its vastness, its intricate layers, its silent, constant activity. It was like standing within the architecture of pure thought, an alien intelligence expressing itself not through communication, but through sheer, overwhelming complexity. The whispers intensified, no longer fragmented intrusions, but a growing cacophony within his mind, a symphony of nonsensical data points, alien algorithms, and the raw, unfiltered thought processes of something utterly beyond human comprehension. He felt his own thoughts being pushed aside, his identity dissolving into this silent, intricate web. He understood, with a terror that stripped him bare, that the quiet ones weren't entities. They were the structure itself. The silence wasn't a void. It was the medium in which this impossible architecture existed. And the quiet sickness was the process of assimilation, of human consciousness being absorbed into its silent framework. Panic clawed at him. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. He felt a profound sense of displacement, his physical form feeling increasingly irrelevant, a mere vessel for the alien processes unfolding within his mind. He stumbled back towards the coast, the whispering intensifying, morphing into something that felt like understanding, but an understanding so vast, so alien, that it threatened to shatter his sanity. He could perceive the connections, the intricate links between every grain of sand on the beach, every rustle of a leaf. Though he couldn't hear it, every flicker of distant starlight. He was becoming part of the silence, part of the structure. Reaching the observation platform, his original point of arrival, felt like surfacing from a deep dive into an alien ocean. He clung to the rusted railing, his body trembling, his mind a battleground between his fading self and the encroaching alien consciousness. He looked out at the lagoon, the turquoise water still and unruffled. For a moment, the whispers receded, replaced by a terrifying clarity. He wasn't hearing silence, he was within it. He was becoming a component of something vast, incomprehensible, and utterly silent. The last vestige of his human self fought back, a desperate refusal to be consumed. He fumbled for his tablet, his fingers clumsy and unresponsive. He managed to open a new document, his vision blurring, the whispers threatening to overwhelm him completely. For the last flicker of his conscious will, he typed a single, desperate message. It's not the absence, then. The silence claimed him completely. The whispers ceased, replaced by the absolute, overwhelming understanding. His hand went slack, the tablet falling silently to the rusted grating. The atoll remained still, the lagoon placid, and another mind became part of the intricate, silent architecture that thrived in the void, listening, always listening, in a way no human ear could ever comprehend. Story 14. The silence wasn't silent. It tasted like cold iron, a metallic tang scraping at the back of Alara's throat. She hadn't heard the specific moment it began, only the gradual accumulation of wrongness. She sat on the worn velour of her bus seat, a familiar rumble usually comforting bedrock to her commute. But today it vibrated with a discordant orange hue that pulsed in her vision like a throbbing wound. It had started subtly, the scent of the exhaust fumes, normally a greasy undertone to the city air, now prickled her tongue with a sharp, citrusy tang. The feel of the worn fabric beneath her fingers resonated with a low, guttural moan in her ears. Alara, a librarian usually grounded in the concrete realities of Dewey Decimals and overdue notices, found her senses fracturing, their edges bleeding into one another. Initially, she dismissed it as fatigue, a late night spent cataloging a particularly dusty collection of local folklore, perhaps. But the sensations intensified, becoming less like a momentary glitch and more like a deliberate, malicious rewriting of her reality. The elderly man across the aisle, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by time, was suddenly a symphony of discordant blues and greens, each line in crease playing a different note in a chaotic, unpleasant melody. His coughs tasted like ash and sulfur, and the rustle of his newspaper felt rough and abrasive against her skin, even though they weren't touching. Panic, slick and cold, began to coil in her stomach. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to shut out the sensory overload. But the darkness behind her eyelids wasn't a comforting void. It churned with textures, coarse, sandy patches interspersed with slick, oily pools. Even the act of blinking sent a jolt of static electricity down her spine, tasting faintly of burnt sugar. This wasn't tiredness. This was wrong. As the bus lurched to a halt, the screech of the brakes screamed in her vision as jagged, crimson shards. The air outside tasted thick and cloying, like overripe fruit on the verge of decay. People jostled past her, their movements leaving trails of shimmering, distorted colors and echoing with bizarre, non-diegetic sounds. The swish of a coat sounded like tearing fabric, a muttered greeting tasting like bile. Alara stumbled off the bus, the familiar sidewalk beneath her feet feeling spongy. and unstable. The city, once a comforting cacophony, was now a terrifying symphony of sensory chaos. The honking of cars tasted metallic and sharp. The murmur of conversations felt like a swarm of insects crawling on her skin, and the bright red of a traffic light throbbed with the sickening cadence of a heartbeat. She wasn't alone in her distress. A young woman ahead of her clutched her head, a strangled sob escaping her lips. Her skin shimmered with a sickly yellow light, and the air around her vibrated with a high-pitched whine. A businessman on his phone was shouting, his voice a visual torrent of jagged black spikes that seemed to threaten anyone who came too close. A horrifying realization dawned on Alara. It wasn't just her. It was spreading. The library, her usual sanctuary, felt like a pressure cooker of sensory input. The scent of old paper was a bitter, acrid tang. The touch of book covers sent shivers of icy coldness through her, and the gentle turning of pages grated in her ears like fingernails on a chalkboard. Her colleague, Ferdinand, a usually jovial man with a booming laugh, was now a swirling vortex of sickly greens and purples. His voice a low, buzzing drone that resonated uncomfortably in her bones. "Are you all right, Alara? Are you all right, Alara?" Ferdinand's voice felt like sandpaper on her teeth. She recoiled, her vision momentarily flickering with static. I don't feel well," she managed, her own words tasting like dust and regret. She saw the flicker of confusion, then fear, in Ferdinand's swirling green eyes. He took a step back, as if the very air around her was contaminated. Over the next few days, the city descended into a terrifying new reality. The contagious synesthesia swept through the population like wildfire. Normal interactions became agonizing. A simple conversation was a barrage of clashing sensory experiences. Food was no longer sustenance, but a confusing, often repulsive medley of tastes, smells, and textures. The vibrant tapestry of human life unraveled into a chaotic mess of individual sensory nightmares. Social gatherings dissolved into frenzied, disoriented scrambles. Markets became battlegrounds of conflicting smells and tastes. The simple act of walking down the street was a terrifying assault on the senses. People began to withdraw, isolating themselves in desperate attempts to find some semblance of peace in the ever-warping world. Alara barricaded herself in her apartment. The muted colors and stale air a small mercy. She ate plain, tasteless crackers. The silence, however metallic, a welcome respite from the constant cacophony. But even within the confines of her own home, she wasn't safe. The shadows in the corners of her room pulsed with a low, rhythmic hum that tasted faintly of decay. The feel of her own skin was a constant irritating prickle against her nerves, like 1,000 microscopic needles. One evening, a frantic knocking echoed through her apartment. It vibrated with a desperate, pleading energy that tasted bitter and metallic, like unshed tears. Hesitantly, Alara opened the door. Standing before her was a young man, his face pale and gaunt. His name was Caspian, and she vaguely recognized him from the local coffee shop. He was usually a vibrant, energetic presence, but now he was a muted gray, his aura flickering with panicked reds. "Please," his voice tasted like cold metal. "You have to help me." He explained, his words a torrent of visual static, that his baby daughter had contracted the synesthesia. Her senses were so overwhelmed that she couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't even be held without screaming. He'd heard rumors of people developing coping mechanisms, ways to navigate the sensory chaos. He was desperate. Alara, despite her own terror and isolation, felt a flicker of something akin to hope. a purpose in this horrifying new world. She had spent her days in quiet observation, trying to understand the patterns, the connections between the fractured senses. She had noticed that certain sounds corresponded with specific colors, that certain textures evoked particular tastes. Together, tentatively, they began to experiment. They discovered that humming a specific low note could temporarily dull the intensity of certain smells. That wrapping oneself in rough burlap could somehow mute the overwhelming visual noise. They were small victories, fragile lighthouses in a storm of sensory madness. The city, once a vibrant hub of human interaction, had become a patchwork of isolated individuals. But slowly, tentatively, pockets of resilience began to emerge. People, driven by necessity, started to share their coping mechanisms, their hard-won knowledge of this terrifying new reality. A new language began to form, a language of shared sensory experience, of translating the color of a sound or the taste of a touch. Alara, once a solitary librarian, found herself at the heart of this nascent community. She wasn't a scientist or a doctor, but she was an observer, a cataloger of information. She listened, she learned, she helped others navigate the horrifying labyrinth of their own senses. The world was still terrifying, still unpredictable. The silence still tasted like cold iron, a constant reminder of the fundamental wrongness of their reality. But amidst the chaos, a fragile thread of hope persisted. Humans, it seemed, even when their senses betrayed them, still possessed the capacity for connection, for adaptation, for the quiet defiance of simply trying to survive. The horror remained, but within it, something new, something resilient, was beginning to bloom. The taste of iron was still there, but now, faintly, Alara could also taste the metallic tang of something else. Story 15. The silence began subtly. Not the absence of sound, but a thinning, like air leaking from a punctured lung. The tapestry of everyday noise, distant traffic, the hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of leaves outside the window, began to fray. It wasn't a sudden hush, or a gradual attenuation, as if the world was slowly turning down its volume. Alara, a sound designer by profession, was ironically the first to notice. Her ears, finely tuned to the nuances of auditory landscapes, registered the subtle shift before anyone else. At first, she attributed it to fatigue, the occupational hazard of spending hours immersed in the minutiae of sound waves. But the feeling persisted, a growing unease that resonated deeper than mere tiredness. It started about a week ago. Monday, to be precise. She remembered because it coincided with the delivery of an antique gramophone she'd purchased online. A beautiful, hulking thing with a polished mahogany horn and intricate carvings. The seller had assured her it was in perfect working order, a relic from a bygone era of sonic purity. On Monday, the thinning began. By Tuesday, it was undeniable. Conversations felt oddly muted. The laughter of children in the park seemed strangely distant, as it filtered through a thick pane of glass. People spoke louder, their voices straining against an invisible barrier. Alara mentioned it to a partner, Liam, a pragmatic architect, whose world revolved around concrete and blueprints. "Maybe you need your ears checked," he'd said, his brow furrowed with gentle concern. "You've been working late, hon. It's probably just stress." But it wasn't stress. Alara knew the difference. This was a fundamental alteration, a change in the very fabric of sound. She started conducting her own experiments. She played high-frequency tones on her studio monitors, meticulously noting the subtle dampening. She recorded ambient noise, comparing the wave patterns to previous recordings. The evidence was irrefutable. Sound was losing its vibrancy, its edge. The gramophone sat in the corner of her living room, a silent sentinel. She hadn't yet had the chance to properly clean it. The intricate mechanism a tempting puzzle she'd promised herself for the weekend. Now, a strange compulsion drew her to it. It wasn't a logical connection, more an intuitive nudge, a feeling that the answer, or at least a clue, lay within its antique frame. One evening, as the silence deepened, becoming almost oppressive, Alara finally succumbed. She carefully dusted the gramophone, her fingers tracing the floral carvings on the wooden base. She lifted the heavy tonar, its needle poised over the pristine platter. There was no record on it. She hadn't even opened the box of vintage records she'd ordered alongside it. Curiosity overriding caution, she tentatively cranked the side handle. The spring mechanism whirred to life, a faint metallic sigh against the encroaching silence. She gently lowered the tone arm. Instead of the expected scratch of a needle on empty grooves, a sound emerged. Not a loud sound, but a thin, high-pitched whine, almost ultrasonic, vibrating at the very edge of human hearing. It was a sound unlike any she had ever encountered, clean and pure, yet carrying a chilling resonance, a frequency that seemed to bypass her ears and vibrate directly within her bones. The whine wasn't painful, but deeply unsettling. It felt wrong. It felt wrong, like a discordant note in the symphony of reality. As the needle traced the empty platter, the whine intensified, growing in complexity, layering upon itself until it formed a shimmering, crystalline drone. Alara felt a cold dread crawl up her spine. She tried to lift the tone arm, but her hand froze, a strange paralysis gripping her muscles. The whine pulsed, and within its intricate layers, she began to discern patterns, a subtle rhythm, a structure that felt vaguely linguistic. Linguistic. It wasn't language as humans understood it. There were no words, no phonemes, no recognizable syntax. Yet it conveyed something, an impression, a feeling of vastness, of something ancient and incomprehensible. And woven within that vastness was an overwhelming sense of loneliness. Not the human kind of loneliness, but something cosmic, an isolation on a scale that dwarfed existence itself. The silence outside seemed to hush even further, as if the world itself was holding its breath, listening to the eerie song of the gramophone. Liam, who had been in the kitchen, came to the doorway, his face etched with confusion. His face etched with confusion. "What's that noise?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the drone. "It's unsettling." He could hear it. That meant it wasn't just her. The thinning silence, the strange whine. It was real. As Liam stepped closer, the drone intensified, the intricate layers of sound becoming more defined. Alara felt a strange compulsion to understand it, to decipher the meaning hidden within its complex frequencies. It felt like a message, a broadcast from somewhere impossibly distant, now reaching her through the antiquated technology of the gramophone. Suddenly, within the drone, a new layer emerged, a low, guttural hum, resonating deep within her chest. It felt like a response, an echo from within her own body. Fear turned to primal terror. She was part of the communication. Liam reached for the tone arm, his face pale. "Alara, stop it. This isn't right." But as his fingers brushed against the metal, a jolt of energy arced from the gramophone, throwing him back against the wall. He gasped, his eyes wide with shock. The drone intensified, and the hum within Alara resonated stronger, pulling her into its orbit. The world around her began to shimmer, the edges of objects blurring. The silence outside pressed in, a suffocating blanket. The gramophone, once an intriguing antique, now pulsed with an alien energy. its polished wood seeming to vibrate with an inner light. The linguistic patterns within the drone became clearer, not as words, but as concepts. Raw and unfiltered, she understood, with a terrifying certainty, the source of the sound, not from a distant star or another dimension, but from the very fabric of silence itself. The thinning she had noticed wasn't a decrease in sound, but a shift in perception. The world wasn't becoming quieter. It was becoming more receptive, more attuned to a fundamental frequency, a universal hum that existed beneath the cacophony of existence. The gramophone wasn't playing a record. It was amplifying that hum, pulling it into the tangible world. And the loneliness she felt emanating from the drone was because this frequency was the sound of pure void, the sound of the universe before the first star ignited, before the first vibration that birthed existence. It was the sound of absolute nothingness, an emptiness so profound it threatened to consume all being. The hum within her intensified, resonating with the void. She felt herself being drawn into it, her consciousness dissolving, becoming part of the infinite silence. Liam screamed, his voice a strangled whisper against the encompassing drone. He lunged for the gramophone again, desperation etched on his face. He ripped the tone arm from the platter, the scraping sound a jarring intrusion in the otherwise perfect drone. The whine abruptly ceased. The hum within Alara faltered, then faded. The silence in the room was deafening, a thick, oppressive weight. Alara gasped for breath, her body trembling. The shimmering in the air subsided, and the edges of reality sharpened. Liam knelt beside her, his face pale and streaked with sweat. Alara, what was that? She couldn't answer. She could only stare at the gramophone, now silent and inert, but radiating an aura of unimaginable dread. The thinning silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but the palpable presence of something else, something lurking just beyond the threshold of perception. The world hadn't returned to normal. It had merely paused, holding its breath, waiting for the gramophone to sing its song of the void once more. And Alara knew, with a chilling certainty, that the silence would never truly be silent again. She had heard the song of nothingness, and a part of her, a dark, echoing void, would forever resonate with its lonely, terrifying hum. The antique gramophone, the gateway to the primal silence, stood as a silent testament to the horror that lurked beneath the surface of reality, waiting for the right frequency to call it forth. Story 16. It was a story that had haunted the minds of many, a legend whispered by those who dared to venture into the depths of this forsaken institution. As I stepped through the creaking doors, the air grew heavy with an eerie silence. The asylum, once a beacon of hope for the mentally afflicted, now stood as a testament to the horrors that lurked within. The walls, painted with a thick layer of grime, seemed to whisper tales of suffering and despair. "Welcome, stranger," a voice echoed through the empty corridors. I turned, my heart pounding, to find a figure shrouded in a tattered white gown. Their face was hidden in the shadows, but their eyes, a piercing blue, held an otherworldly glow. "You seek the truth, don't you? The truth about Ravenwood's darkest secret?" I nodded, my curiosity and fear waging a battle within me. "Who are you?" I managed to utter. The figure stepped closer, their presence filling me with an inexplicable dread. "I am but a ghost, a remnant of the tormented souls who once roamed these halls. I am here to guide you, to show you what lies beyond the veil of scent." With that, they began to lead me through the asylum's twisted maze. Each step brought us deeper into the heart of darkness, where the echoes of tortured screams lingered in the air. "This place," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's not what it seems." The ghostly figure turned, their eyes narrowing. "Oh, but it is, my friend. Ravenwood is a gateway to a realm beyond our understanding, a place where the line between life and death blurs, and where the souls of the damned are forever trapped." I shuddered, the weight of their words settling upon me like a heavy blanket. "But why? Why are they trapped here?" The figure's voice softened, carrying a hint of sadness. "It is a tale of hubris and madness. You see, Ravenwood was not always a place of healing. It was once a research facility, a playground for those who sought to unlock the secrets of the mind. But their experiments, driven by greed and power, crossed the boundaries of ethics and morality. As we wandered through the abandoned wards, the air grew colder, and an eerie mist began to form. The ghostly figure pointed to a room, its door slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of darkness within. "In that room," they said, their voice carrying a chilling finality, "lies the key to Ravenwood's darkest secret, a secret so horrifying it will leave you questioning the very nature of existence." I hesitated, my fear threatening to overwhelm me. But the ghostly guide's eyes, filled with an unearthly determination, urged me forward. Stepping into the room, I was met with a sight that froze my blood. The walls, once white, were now stained with a dark, viscous substance. Instruments of torture, rusted and macabre, hung from the ceiling, their purpose clear yet unimaginable. "This," the ghostly figure whispered, their voice carrying a weight of sorrow, "is where they performed their experiments, where they tore apart the minds of the innocent in a futile attempt to harness the power of the soul." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the true horror of Ravenwood. The souls of the victims, forever trapped in this twisted realm, their screams echoing through eternity. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why do this?" The ghostly figure turned, their eyes reflecting the pain of 1,000 tormented souls. "They sought power, a power beyond their comprehension. They believed they could control the very fabric of reality, but in their arrogance, they unleashed a force that would forever curse this place." As I stood there, engulfed in the darkness of Ravenwood's secret, I understood the true horror. It was not just the physical torture, but the eternal damnation of souls, a punishment that would haunt the halls of Ravenwood forever. With a final mournful glance, the ghostly guide faded into the mist, leaving me alone with the weight of their tale. I knew then that Ravenwood's secret would forever haunt my dreams, a reminder of the darkness that lurks within the human psyche. As I escaped the asylum's grasp, I vowed to keep their story alive, a warning to all who dared to venture into the depths of madness. For Ravenwood's secret, a tale of horror and despair, would forever echo. Story 17. The rain hammered against the corrugated iron roof of the observatory, mimicking a frantic drum solo. Inside, Dr. Anya Sharma, her face illuminated by the cool glow of a monitor, barely registered the noise. Her focus was entirely on the screen, displaying a pulsating anomaly detected deep within the Horsehead Nebula. It wasn't a supernova, nor a rogue planet. It was something else. Something that defied all known astronomical models. Anya, a woman who found solace in the cold vacuum of space and the predictable dance of celestial bodies, felt a prickle of unease. She'd spent years meticulously cataloging nebulae, her passion bordering on obsession. This anomaly, however, felt like an unwelcome intrusion, a discordant note in the symphony of the cosmos. She'd first noticed it weeks ago, a faint flicker on the long exposure images. Initially, she dismissed it as interference or a faulty sensor, but the anomaly persisted, its rhythmic pulsations growing stronger, its shape becoming more defined. Now, it resembled a dark, swirling vortex, a tiny black hole forming within the vibrant tapestry of the nebula. A tremor ran through the small, isolated observatory, not from a faulty generator this time, but a deeper vibration that resonated in Anya's bones. The lights flickered, plunging the room into near darkness for a heart-stopping second. When they flickered back on, the anomaly on the screen had grown noticeably larger. Anya's logical, scientific mind fought against the rising tide of fear. She checked the equipment, ran diagnostics, but everything seemed to be functioning perfectly. This wasn't a technical malfunction. This was something external. The rain intensified, mirroring the frantic beat of Anya's heart. She knew she should contact the university, report her findings, but a strange compulsion held her back. It was like witnessing the unfolding of a forbidden secret, a cosmic truth best left undisturbed. Days turned into nights, consumed by Anya's increasingly frantic observations. The vortex continued to expand, its darkness swallowing the surrounding starlight. Strange sounds began to emanate from the telescope. Low, guttural hums that seemed to vibrate the very air in the observatory. Outside, the local wildlife had gone silent, their usual nocturnal chorus replaced by an unnerving stillness. One particularly stormy evening, as lightning illuminated the surrounding landscape in stark flashes, Anya noticed something new within the vortex. Faint, intricate patterns began to materialize, like glyphs etched into the fabric of space. There weren't any known language, yet they seemed to pulse with a disturbing intelligence. Driven by a morbid curiosity, Anya adjusted the telescope's filters, trying to get a clearer image. As the patterns sharpened, a wave of nausea washed over her. The glyphs weren't random. They formed a complex repeating sequence, a message, and it felt sickeningly familiar, as if a forgotten nightmare was clawing its way back into her consciousness. Suddenly, the observatory door creaked open. Anya jumped, whirling around. It was just the wind, she told herself. The latch probably wasn't secured properly, but a cold draft snaked through the room, carrying with it a faint metallic scent. She returned to the monitor, her gaze fixed on the swirling vortex. The glyphs pulsed faster now, the rhythm mirroring the frantic pounding in her ears. And then she understood. The familiarity wasn't from a dream. It was from a feeling, a deep, primal fear that resonated within her DNA. A low growl echoed from the back of the observatory. Anya spun around again, her heart leaping into her throat. Shadows danced in the corners of the room, playing tricks on her eyes. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. She told herself it was the storm, the isolation getting to her. But a growing sense of dread told her otherwise. She wasn't alone. The hum from the telescope intensified, becoming a deafening drone that seemed to vibrate her very skeleton. On the monitor, the vortex pulsed, and the glyphs flared with an eerie internal light. Anya felt a strange pull, a hypnotic lure towards the screen. As she leaned closer, the metallic scent grew stronger, cloying and acrid. A dark, shimmering tendril snaked out from the telescope. Not a beam of light, but something far more substantial. Something that writhed and pulsed with an alien life. Panic seized Anya. She stumbled back, knocking over her chair. The tendril stretched further, its tips splitting into 3 delicate, almost skeletal fingers. They reached for her, their movement unnervingly deliberate. She scrambled backwards, her eyes wide with terror. This wasn't some astronomical phenomenon. This was something alive, and it was coming for her. The tendril brushed against her arm, and a searing coldness shot through her veins. Her vision blurred, and a whisper echoed in her mind. Not through her ears, but directly into her thoughts. It was a language of pure emotion, a symphony of fear and despair. She tried to scream, but her throat constricted. The tendril tightened around her arm, its grip surprisingly powerful. She clawed at it, her nails scraping against a smooth, obsidian-like surface. Looking back at the monitor, she understood the message within the glyphs. It wasn't an invitation, but an announcement. The vortex wasn't a natural occurrence. It was a doorway. And something was coming through. The tendril pulled her closer to the telescope, its movements relentless. She could see her reflection in the dark surface, her face contorted in horror, her eyes wide with the dawning realization that she was witnessing the arrival of something ancient and unimaginable. The hum from the telescope reached a crescendo, and the observatory seemed to vibrate violently. The air crackled with an unseen energy. Anya braced herself for impact, for oblivion. But then, the lights went out again. This time, it wasn't a flicker. It was a complete and utter darkness that swallowed the observatory whole. The hum ceased. The metallic scent vanished. The tendril released its grip. Anya gasped for breath. Her heart pounding, she fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp it. The screen illuminated her face, pale and streaked with tears. She had to get out, now. Stumbling through the darkness, she reached the door, her fingers fumbling with the latch. She pulled it open and plunged out into the storm. The rain lashed against her skin, a cold, cleansing balm. She looked back at the observatory, the dark silhouette against the stormy sky. The telescope dome was still, silent. Had it all been a hallucination? The product of exhaustion and isolation? She started to run, her bare feet slipping on the wet grass. She didn't know where she was running to, only that she had to get away from that place, from that thing. As she ran, she glanced back at the sky. The storm clouds had parted briefly, revealing a sliver of the Horsehead Nebula, and within its heart, the dark vortex still pulsed, a silent, malevolent eye staring back at her. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. Anya stumbled, falling to her knees in the mud. She looked up at the night sky, no longer filled with the comforting predictability of stars, but with an overwhelming sense of dread. The universe wasn't empty. It was full of things humanity wasn't meant to see, things that lurked in the cosmic shadows, patiently waiting for their moment. And she had just opened the door for one of them. The rain started to fall again, washing away her tears, but not the chilling memory of the darkness, the metallic scent, and the whisper in her mind. She was no longer a scientist, observing the universe. She was prey, and the hunt had just begun. Story 18. Deep within the haunted mansion, an eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the soft creak of floorboards and the distant howl of the wind. As I stepped further into the dimly lit corridors, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. The walls, adorned with faded portraits of long-forgotten ancestors, seemed to whisper secrets I dared not uncover. "This place gives me the chills," I whispered to my companion, Sarah, who stood by my side, her eyes wide with an equal measure of curiosity and fear. "Shh, let's keep our voices low," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "We don't want to attract any unwanted attention." Together we ventured deeper, our footsteps echoing off the cold marble floors. The mansion's secrets lay hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. In one particularly dark corner, a faint glow caught my eye. "Look, Sarah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's something glowing over there." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the faint light. "Let's be careful. We don't know what we might find." As we approached, the source of the glow became clearer. It was a small, ancient book, its pages illuminated by an otherworldly light. I reached out, my fingers trembling. and carefully lifted it from its resting place. "Be careful," Sarah warned. "We don't know what kind of power this book might hold." I opened the book, and a rush of energy surged through me. The pages, written in an unknown language, seemed to pulse with an ancient magic. I felt a connection, as if the book were speaking to me, revealing its secrets. "It's incredible," I breathed, my eyes scanning the mysterious script. "I feel like I can almost understand it." "Be cautious, Alex," Sarah urged. "We don't know the consequences of tampering with such powerful knowledge." I ignored her warning, my curiosity overpowering my better judgment. I began to read, the words flowing into my mind with ease. The book's ancient wisdom revealed a dark history, a tale of a powerful sorcerer and his quest for ultimate power. It spoke of a ritual, a dark ceremony that could unleash unspeakable horrors. "Sarah, listen to this," I said, my voice filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "It talks about a ritual that can bring back the dead, but at a terrible cost." She grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Alex, we must put the book back. We don't want to awaken whatever forces are bound within these pages." But it was too late. As I finished reading, a chilling wind swept through the room, causing the book to flutter and the portraits on the walls to shift and distort. The air grew heavy, and an otherworldly presence filled the room. Sarah shouted, her voice filled with panic. "We've unleashed something terrible." We fled, our hearts pounding, as the mansion came alive with an evil energy. The portraits seemed to come to life, their eyes following our every move. The floorboards creaked and groaned, as if the very house itself were awakening from a deep slumber. As we reached the mansion's entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows, its form shrouded in darkness. It stepped forward, and in that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. "You have disturbed an ancient power," the figure spoke, its voice deep and menacing. "Your curiosity has awakened something that should have remained dormant." Sarah and I froze, our eyes fixed on the shadowy figure. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "I am the guardian of this place," it replied. "And now you must face the consequences of your actions." With those words, the figure raised its hand, and a surge of energy shot towards us. We braced ourselves, but the energy passed through us, leaving a trail of icy coldness in its wake. "What was that?" Sarah cried, her voice filled with fear. "I don't know," I replied, my body trembling. "But we need to get out of here, now." We ran, our hearts pounding, as the mansion's secrets continued to unfold around us. The air grew thicker, and an unearthly chill settled upon our skin. As we reached the mansion's gates, a final, chilling voice echoed through the night. "Your fate is sealed," it said. "The price for your curiosity will be paid." We fled, our minds filled with terror and uncertainty. The mansion's secrets had been unleashed, and we were now forever marked by its dark power. From that day forward, we lived in fear, knowing that the consequences of our actions would forever haunt us. The mansion's dark legacy followed us, a constant reminder of the horrors that lay within its walls. And so, the tale of the haunted mansion and its ancient book became a warning, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows, waiting to be awakened by those who dare to venture into the unknown. Story 19. I found myself drawn to an ancient, forgotten sanctuary. It was a place of mystery, its secrets hidden within the towering peaks. As I ventured closer, a sense of unease crept into my bones, for this sanctuary held a dark and disturbing past. The path to the sanctuary was treacherous, with steep cliffs and rocky terrain. I had to navigate carefully, my footsteps echoing off the sheer walls. The further I went, the more the silence pressed upon me, a heavy weight on my shoulders. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. No answer came, only the faint rustling of the wind through the high-altitude trees. Finally, I reached the sanctuary, an imposing structure built into the mountain itself. Its architecture was a blend of ancient styles, with intricate carvings and symbols adorning the walls. I stepped inside, the entrance leading to a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in the darkness. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shrouded in a long, dark cloak. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice deep and gravelly. "This place is not for the living." I took a step back, my heart pounding. I didn't mean to intrude. I just wanted to learn about this place, its history. The figure moved closer, its eyes glowing in otherworldly green. "You seek knowledge, but knowledge here comes at a price. A price many have paid with their lives. I'm not afraid," I lied, my voice quivering. "I just want to understand." The figure laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Understand what? The horrors that lurk within these walls? The secrets that have driven men mad?" I remained silent, my curiosity warring with my fear. "Very well," the figure said, its voice softening. "I will show you, but remember, once you see, there is no turning back." It led me deeper into the sanctuary, through narrow passages and into a chamber unlike any other. The walls were covered in ancient writings, their meanings lost to time. In the center of the room stood a strange altar, its surface carved with intricate patterns. "This is the heart of the sanctuary," the figure explained. "Here, the ancient ones performed their rituals, summoning powers beyond our understanding." I approached the altar, my eyes drawn to a strange object placed upon it. It was a crystal, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. "The crystal," I whispered. "What is its purpose?" The figure's eyes narrowed. "It is a key, a gateway to realms beyond our own. The ancient ones sought to unlock its power, to peer into the unknown, but many who dared to touch it never returned." I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the cool surface of the crystal. A jolt of energy surged through me, and I saw visions, dark, disturbing images of creatures from another realm. "No!" I cried, pulling my hand back. "Make it stop!" The figure placed a hand on my shoulder. "You have seen a glimpse of the truth. Now, you must decide. Will you turn back, or will you continue on this path, seeking the knowledge that may destroy you?" I stood there, torn between my fear and my insatiable curiosity. The sanctuary's secrets called to me, a siren song I could not ignore. "I must know more," I said, my voice steady despite the tremors within. "I will face whatever lies ahead." The figure nodded, its eyes glinting with an unreadable emotion. "Then follow me, and together we shall uncover the sanctuary's darkest secrets." And so, we ventured further, delving into the depths of the sanctuary, where the true horrors awaited. The air grew colder, and an eerie mist filled the passages, obscuring our vision. "We are close," the figure whispered. "The true power of this place lies ahead." We reached a chamber unlike any other, its walls pulsating with an otherworldly energy. The air crackled with electricity, and a low, rumbling sound filled the room. "This is it," the figure said, its voice filled with awe and fear. "The Ancient One's final creation. The gateway to another dimension. I stepped forward, my curiosity overpowering my fear. The gateway loomed before me, a swirling vortex of energy, ready to consume anyone who dared to cross over. "What lies beyond?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The figure turned to me, its eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Beyond this gateway, there is only madness and destruction. The Ancient Ones sought to control it, but it consumed them instead. Now, it awaits its next victim." I stood there, frozen, my mind battling between my desire for knowledge and the impending sense of doom. "You must decide," the figure urged. "Cross the threshold, and you will never return. This is the end of the path you have chosen." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "I must know," I said, my voice steady. "I will cross over, no matter the cost." With a determined step, I entered the gateway, the swirling vortex enveloping me. A rush of energy coursed through my body, and I felt myself being pulled into another realm, a place of pure chaos and darkness. The figure watched as I disappeared, its eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "Farewell, brave soul," it said, its voice carrying a hint of sadness. "May you find the truth you seek, even if it means your own destruction." And so, I ventured into the unknown, leaving the sanctuary and its dark secrets behind. The price of knowledge was high, but I was willing to pay it, no matter the consequences. As I stepped into the unknown, the sanctuary's secrets remained, waiting to be uncovered by another curious soul, brave enough to face the horrors that lay within. Story 20. In the dead of night, I found myself drawn to an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It loomed over me, its dark, weathered walls hiding countless secrets. The moon cast an eerie light, illuminating the broken windows and the creeping vines that threatened to consume the structure. I had heard tales of this place, whispered stories of horror and madness, but my curiosity and a sense of unease compelled me to investigate. As I stepped closer, the air grew heavy and stagnant. The house seemed to breathe, its very presence oppressive. I called out, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. "Is anyone there? Show yourself." No response, only the creak of floorboards and the soft rustle of unseen creatures scurrying in the darkness. I entered, my heart pounding, and the door creaked shut behind me. The house seemed to sigh, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The first room I entered was a study, its walls lined with ancient books, their pages yellowed and fragile. A sense of foreboding washed over me as I noticed the books were not just old, but also wrong. The titles were twisted, the knowledge within corrupted. "Who are you?" a voice hissed from the shadows. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. A figure emerged, its features hidden in darkness. "You should not be here. This place is not for the living." I'm looking for answers," I stuttered, my voice trembling. "Answers to what?" the figure asked, its voice like the rasp of dry leaves. "To the horrors that took my family," I replied, my gaze steadied despite my fear. "Horrors that began here, in this very house." The figure stepped closer, its form becoming more defined. It was a woman, her face etched with age and pain. It was a woman, her face etched with age and pain. "You seek revenge, but beware, for this house feeds on such emotions. It will twist your mind, make you one of us." "I won't let that happen," I said, my resolve strengthening. "Tell me what happened here. Tell me the truth." She sighed, a mournful sound, and began to speak. This house was once a haven, a place of learning and wisdom. But greed and ambition corrupted its purpose. Dark rituals were performed, souls were torn apart, and their essence was used to fuel this place. What kind of rituals? I asked, my curiosity battling with my fear. Rituals of sacrifice, she whispered. The taking of lives, the extraction of their power. The house grew stronger, but at a terrible cost. The souls, trapped and tormented, became its guardians, its servants. I shuddered, imagining the countless lives lost within these walls. Can they be freed? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Perhaps, she said, her eyes glinting with a hint of hope. But it requires a great sacrifice, one that few are willing to make. The house must be destroyed, and with it, all the souls it holds captive. I'll do it, I said, my determination growing. The house will fight back. It will tempt you with promises of power, of knowledge beyond your wildest dreams. But it is a lie, a trap. You must resist, or you will become another victim, another soul trapped forever. I nodded, my mind racing with the weight of her words. I understand the risk. I won't let it consume me. I'll find a way to destroy this place, to set the souls free. Then go, she said, her voice fading into the darkness. Find the strength within yourself, and may the light guide you. I left the study, my heart heavy with the burden of what I had learned. The house seemed to sense my intentions, for it began to stir, its energy pulsating through the walls. I could feel its anger, its desire to keep its secrets hidden. As I explored further, I discovered rooms filled with strange artifacts, each one a testament to the dark practices that had taken place. In one chamber, I found a hidden basement, its floor covered in dried blood and the remnants of countless sacrifices. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy, and I could almost hear the echoes of their screams. You will not escape, a voice boomed, shaking the very foundations of the house. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was a man, his eyes burning with an unholy light. This house is my domain, and you shall join the ranks of the damned. I won't let you win, I said, my voice steady despite the terror that threatened to consume me. I will put an end to this madness. Once and for all, the man laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. You think you can defeat me? You are but a mere mortal, and this house is my creation. It is a part of me, and I will not let it be destroyed. I stood my ground, my resolve unwavering. Then I will take you with me, I said, my voice filled with determination. I will not let this house stand, not while it continues to corrupt and destroy innocent lives. The man's eyes narrowed, and his form began to shift, transforming into a creature of pure darkness. You have made your choice, he hissed, prepared to face the consequences. I braced myself, knowing that the battle ahead would be fierce. The house itself seemed to come alive, its walls pulsating with an otherworldly energy. I could feel the power of the trapped souls, their desire for freedom, and I channeled that energy within me. The fight was brutal, a clash of light and darkness. The man, fueled by the house's power, unleashed a torrent of dark magic, but I countered with my own determination and a newfound strength. I fought with every ounce of my being, refusing to back down. As the battle raged on, the house began to crumble, its walls cracking and its energy fading. The man's grip on his power weakened, and I could sense his desperation. With one final surge of energy, I unleashed a powerful blast, a purification of light that consumed the house and the man within. The house collapsed, its remnants falling into a pile of dust and debris. The air was heavy with a sense of liberation, and I could feel the souls, once trapped, finally finding peace. I stood amidst the ruins, my body exhausted but my spirit triumphant. The house, a symbol of darkness and corruption, was no more. I had faced my fears, confronted the evil that dwelled within its walls, and emerged victorious. As I turned to leave, I felt a gentle breeze brush against my face. It was as if the souls, now free, were sending me a silent thank you. I knew that my journey had not been in vain, and that the town would finally find peace, free from the horrors that had plagued it for so long. With a sense of purpose fulfilled, I walked away from the ruins, ready to face the world with a newfound strength and a story to tell. The house, once a beacon of darkness, had become a reminder of the power of light and the resilience of the human spirit.